Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The hum of the engine grew faint as the ranger's truck rumbled down the narrow, winding mountain road. Beside him, the deep expanse of the Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly, jagged peaks looming like silent sentinels against the sky. It had been a long drive, and the weight of the solitude was beginning to settle in, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He adjusted his rearview mirror, a last glance at the world he was leaving behind. A thin sliver of twilight was fading behind him. The radio, which had been mostly silent throughout the journey, crackled to life. "Ranger 223, come in." The dispatcher's voice was crisp, professional, a reassuring sound that tugged at the edges of his mind. He was finally here. The station he'd been assigned to was small, isolated, hidden deep within the heart of the park, far from the bustling trails and crowded campgrounds. He'd heard the stories. Who hadn't? A new park ranger was always a target for tales of ghosts, strange creatures, and the unexplainable events that seemed to plague those brave enough, or foolish enough, to venture into the park after dark. But it was a job, and he was trained to handle whatever might come his way. "You'll be alone on this shift, Ranger 223, the dispatcher continued. "The usual crew's on leave, but everything should be quiet. Check in with us every couple of hours, and don't forget, listen for anything unusual on the emergency frequency. You never know what might come through those mountains at night." The ranger nodded, even though he knew the dispatcher couldn't see him. He'd read the notes on his assignment, done the necessary prep work. He was a man of reason, of logic, but the unease that gnawed at the pit of his stomach couldn't be dismissed. The road twisted and turned, the world around him dimming as night fell, the last of the sunlight fading over the mountains, leaving only shadows in its wake. As the truck rounded a bend, the ranger caught sight of the station in the distance, a small cabin surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around it. It looked like a relic from another time, old wood weathered by countless seasons, the kind of place that could hide countless secrets. He pulled the truck into the small parking area, the tires crunching against gravel. The air was thick and cold, a biting chill that scraped against his skin like ice. He grabbed his pack and stepped out of the truck, the weight of the night settling in with every step toward the cabin. His boots crunched in the snow as he made his way to the door. The wind howled through the trees, sending a low moan through the branches that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The mountains were watching. Inside, the station was quiet. Too quiet. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, mixed with something earthy, almost like the scent of wet stone. The flickering light from an old lamp cast strange shadows on the walls, which seemed to stretch unnaturally, making the small room feel even smaller. The radio sat on the counter, its dials dusty but intact. He ran his hand over the surface, tracing the contours of the ancient machine, and then sat down at the desk. The logbook was open, the pages yellowed with age. He flipped through it absently, scanning the notes left by the previous rangers. Some were routine, others more personal, brief mentions of wildlife sightings, strange weather patterns, even reports of strange sounds late at night. Nothing that would have made him pause, until his eyes fell upon one entry that seemed out of place. "If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside." His fingers hovered over the page. The handwriting was messy, frantic. The date was 5 years ago, and this exact night. A shiver ran down his spine. He had heard stories of rangers losing their grip on reality, succumbing to the isolation, but this felt different. He scanned the rest of the entry, but the rest of the words were nothing more than an indecipherable jumble of ink smudges and half-formed thoughts. The warning lingered in his mind, sending a cold ripple through him. His eyes darted to the radio again, now silent. The sense of unease that had been growing since he arrived began to take root. It was as if the air around him had thickened, becoming heavy and oppressive. There was something wrong here, something he couldn't quite place. The world outside felt distant, as though the trees themselves were watching. He felt, for the first time, the weight of being alone in the wilderness, completely alone. He leaned forward, grabbed the microphone, and keyed the radio. "Ranger 223 calling dispatch. Can you hear me?" A brief moment of silence followed. Then the static crackled to life. "This is dispatch. We copy you, Ranger 223. How's everything out there?" His voice, though steady, felt unnaturally loud in the stillness of the station. "Everything's good, just settling in for the night shift. No issues yet." There was a pause on the other end, the static fading in and out. "All right. Remember, you're on your own out there tonight. Keep an eye on the emergency frequency. We'll check in again in a couple of hours. Stay safe, Ranger." He clicked off the radio, his mind still on that strange entry in the logbook. Why would someone write something like that? "Don't answer, don't look outside." What kind of warning was that? It didn't make sense. There was no history of any incidents at this station, at least none that had made it into the official records. The wind picked up again outside, howling louder than before, but it wasn't the wind that made his stomach twist. It was the thought of that entry. The words replayed over and over in his head like a broken record. What had happened to the ranger who'd written it? Where were they now? As the clock ticked on, the ranger tried to shake off the feeling of unease. It was just nerves, he reasoned. It had to be. There was nothing in the mountains that could harm him. Not here. Not now. But then the radio crackled again. This time, the voice wasn't dispatch. A soft, broken whisper came through the static, faint at first, but unmistakable. "Help me. It's watching me. I can't move." His breath caught in his throat. The voice was distorted, crackling with interference, but there was no mistaking it. It was the unmistakable tone of a person in distress. His pulse quickened. He grabbed the mic again, his hands shaking. "This is Ranger 223. Who is this? Can you hear me?" Nothing. Silence. Just the static. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at the clock. It was late. Too late for any ranger to be out here, let alone calling for help. He keyed the radio again, voice tight with tension. "This is Ranger 223. I'm here. Where are you?" There was no answer. Just the cold whisper, distorted and broken. "Help me. Please, I can't move." He turned, eyes flicking to the door. The night outside was pitch black. No stars in sight, just the endless sea of shadows. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisted and reaching. His mind raced as the voice repeated itself over and over, trapped in the static. The wind howled louder. Something was wrong. He tried the radio again, voice shaking now. "Who's out there? I'm coming. What's going on?" Still, no response. Only the whisper. The voice seemed to be growing fainter, but more urgent. "I can't move. It's not possible," he thought. "There's no one else out here." Dispatch said no one else was in the area. Then the final words came through, clear as day, breaking through the static like a scream. "Don't answer. Don't look outside." The transmission ended with a sudden, sharp crack, leaving only the eerie silence of the mountains to fill the space. He was left staring at the radio, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind was spinning. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a malfunction. Something or someone was out there. Something that wanted him to stay inside. Something that didn't want him to look outside. His hands tightened around the microphone, knuckles white. But it was too late. The voice had already started again. The voice had started again. The radio crackled again. The static surged, filling the small ranger station like a dark, oppressive presence. The whisper, distant and muffled, had now become a strange, incoherent jumble of words that twisted and warped like a nightmare trying to escape the static. For a moment, the ranger thought he might have imagined it, but then the faintest trace of a voice emerged, growing clearer as it sliced through the crackling feedback. "It's watching me. Please, help me." The words came so suddenly, so desperately, that his heart lurched in his chest. His fingers tightened around the microphone, his knuckles white. There was no mistaking it this time. This wasn't a glitch or interference. This was a person, someone out there calling for help, trapped. His pulse quickened as he pressed the button. "This is Ranger 223, I'm listening. Can you hear me? Where are you? What's happening?" His voice trembled, a mix of fear and resolve. For a moment, nothing. Only the hollow echo of silence. He waited, every nerve in his body straining with anticipation. Then a faint crackle returned. The words came through slower this time, stretched as though the speaker was in pain, their voice breaking apart with each syllable. "Please, you can't help me. It won't let me move." The ranger's breath caught in his throat. There was a terrible weight to the words, an unbearable sense of helplessness that pressed down on him like a physical force. The message, the desperation, it felt all too real. But even as the words repeated, the static began to distort them, turning them into a grotesque mockery of human speech. "Don't look outside. It's watching." The last part sent a shiver crawling down his spine. His gaze instinctively snapped toward the window. The forest outside was still, too still. The air was unnaturally quiet, the trees unmoving, their skeletal branches etched against the night sky like claws. His eyes flicked back to the radio. No more voice, just the crackling hum of static. His breath was heavy now, his pulse pounding in his ears as the weight of the situation pressed harder. He turned the volume dial, trying to clear up the interference. The harsh noise faded slightly, but the voice had stopped. The echo of those last words, "It's watching," clung to the air, thick and suffocating. Slowly, almost against his will, he turned toward the door. The silence outside felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. For a moment he stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. His hand trembled as it hovered near the door handle. Part of him wanted to step outside, to investigate, to do something. But another part of him, the part that remembered the warning in the logbook, wanted to stay inside, to lock the door, to shut the world out. But the voice kept playing in his mind. "Don't look outside." The wind howled again, louder this time, and with it came a series of low, haunting creaks from the trees just outside the station. A chill crawled across his skin, and he shuddered involuntarily. The trees seemed to shift in the darkness, though he couldn't see their movement. His mind played tricks on him, but his instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He forced himself to turn away from the door. There were more immediate concerns. Who had sent the call? What had happened to them? And why did they sound like they were in such agony? The logbook. He needed to look again, see if there was anything else. The previous ranger's warning echoed in his mind. Don't answer. Don't look outside. He grabbed the logbook, flipping through the pages. But now, the faint sound of something scraping against the window stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a subtle noise, barely audible, but there was no mistaking it. Something was outside. The ranger stiffened, his body locking up as he listened. Scrape, scrape. The noise was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic, like nails against glass. His gaze shot to the window where the dark, impenetrable night stretched beyond the thin glass. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but he could see nothing. Nothing but shadows. He walked slowly toward the window, trying to remain calm. His breath was shallow, his heart racing in his chest as he approached the glass. As he neared, he could see his own reflection faintly in the window's surface. His eyes were wide, his face pale. Scrape, scrape. The sound came again, louder this time. The scraping moved in a slow, deliberate motion, coming from somewhere outside. His hand hovered over the blinds, but fear held him back. "Don't look outside." The voice whispered again, unbidden, like a warning from the darkest part of his mind. He couldn't help it. He needed to know what was out there. With a trembling hand, he pulled the blinds open just slightly, just enough to get a glimpse. The cold, bitter wind rushed in, and for a split second, he could see nothing but the thick expanse of trees and the inky blackness between them. The shadows shifted in strange ways, too far apart, too disconnected, as if the darkness itself were moving. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes, but there was nothing there. Nothing that could explain the sound. But then, a figure. It was fleeting, barely visible through the shadows, tall, thin, unnatural. It was there, and then it was gone, swallowed by the forest in an instant. But for that one terrible moment, he had seen it. Or had he? His heart thundered in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His breath came in shallow gasps. He jerked the blinds shut, the movement sharp and frantic. He backed, away from the window, his mind scrambling to process what he had just seen or thought he had seen. It was gone. Whatever it was gone. But the unsettling sense of being watched remained. The radio crackled again, slicing through the thick silence. He almost didn't want to answer, but he had to know. Was anyone else out there? He snatched the microphone. "Ranger 223 to dispatch. Do you copy?" Silence. Nothing but the static hummed on the other end. He pressed the button again. "Dispatch, come in. I've got a situation here. Are you receiving me?" But the radio remained silent. No reply. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the silence stretched on. The pressure inside the station grew unbearable. The isolation was suffocating. He stared at the radio for a moment, wondering if he was losing his mind. But then the voice returned, faint and distorted, as though it had been waiting, lingering in the static. "It's still out there. It's coming. It's watching." He felt his stomach drop. The voice was no longer a plea. It was a warning. And then the final horrific words echoed through the static. "You can't escape." The words reverberated in the ranger's mind like the toll of a distant bell, growing louder, clearer with every passing second. You can't escape. They weren't just a warning. They were a promise. His fingers trembled around the radio, microphone, but no other words came through. Silence. The static buzzed, leaving only the oppressive weight of the night in the room. The temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder by the second. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the mountain's altitude. It was an unnatural chill, seeping into his bones, as if the very atmosphere had turned hostile. For a long moment, the ranger stood frozen, staring at the radio in disbelief. His mind raced, his heart pounded against his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. Was it a prank? A malfunction? No, he knew deep down that something far worse was at play here. Something is out there. The dark shapes outside the window seemed to dance in his peripheral vision, stretching and warping in the shadows. He couldn't look back. He couldn't afford to see it again. The mere thought of it, the unnatural figure he had glimpsed for that split second, made his skin crawl. The wind had stopped. The silence outside was profound now, but it was the kind of silence that felt wrong. It pressed against the walls of the cabin, suffocating the air. The forest had gone still. The trees no longer swayed in the wind. Not a single rustling leaf. Just stillness, and then scrape. It came again. The sound of nails or claws dragging along the surface of the cabin. Slowly, methodically. Scrape, scrape, scrape. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. The sound came from behind him. A sharp, cold wave of dread swept over him as he turned slowly, his gaze shifting toward the corner of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, long, creeping across the walls, pooling like liquid blackness in the dim light. His breath caught in his throat. The air grew heavier, as though something ancient and suffocating was pressing down on him. The very fabric of reality felt fragile, like it might tear at any moment. He took a step back, his foot brushing against something, a small object that had been knocked to the floor. He glanced down, his pulse quickening. It was a photo frame, but not just any photo frame. It was old, cracked, and the picture inside had faded with time. But what disturbed him most was the image. It was of the station from years ago, when it had first been built. A group of rangers stood around it, smiling, their faces frozen in time. But there was one detail that stopped him cold. In the background, barely visible, stood a figure, tall, thin, unnatural, a shadow among shadows. The figure's outline was so faint, so subtle, that he had almost missed it. But now that his eyes had locked onto it, he couldn't look away. It was the same figure he had seen in the forest earlier. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It's been here before. This wasn't the first time someone had been trapped. In this station, haunted by this thing. He grabbed the photo frame, his breath shallow and ragged, his hands trembling as he set it aside. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Could this be some kind of ghost? A curse? Or something worse, something older, something that had been feeding off the fear of every ranger who had come here before? He needed answers. But the logbook, the last entry, had been so cryptic, and the radio only gave him more questions. There had to be more, something buried in the past, something that could explain what was happening. As if on cue, the radio crackled again, interrupting his thoughts. This time, the voice was clearer, but it was different. The static had thinned, revealing a low, guttural growl that carried with it an unmistakable sense of menace. "I can't move." The ranger's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was the same one from before, the one pleading for help. But this time, it was different. This time, there was something wrong with the voice. It wasn't just desperation. It was filled with a deep, gnawing fear. It was as if the speaker was struggling to hold on to their humanity. "I'm right behind you." The voice rasped. His spine went rigid. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned. He didn't want to. He didn't dare. But some primal instinct pushed him, forcing him to face what was behind him. The room was still. Too still. Nothing. No figure. No shape in the shadows. Just the walls, the floor, and the stillness. But that didn't make him feel any better. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he stepped backward toward the door, his mind screaming that he needed to leave. But the door wouldn't open. His hand gripped the handle and he twisted it, but the door was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Scrape. 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 This time it was louder. Closer. His stomach dropped. A shadow passed in front of the small, dust-covered window by the door. He froze, staring at it with wide eyes, unable to move. It's out there. The thought tore through him, a cold knife of terror. The figure from the window was now outside. The door, its presence palpable, like a thick fog creeping into the room. Suddenly the radio crackled again. The same low, guttural growl. But this time it wasn't a voice. It was something else. A growl that rumbled deep in the static, a sound so primal that it seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the ranger. And then, amidst the static, the voice returned, no longer pleading, no longer terrified. It was cold, controlled. You're not alone anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. His mind spun, heart hammering in his chest. The growling had stopped, but now there was something worse. A presence, something he couldn't see, but he could feel it. The weight of its eyes on him, pressing against his skin. The air inside the cabin felt thick, saturated with dread. The shadows in the corners of the room were alive now, twisting, growing. He couldn't tell where they ended and where the darkness began. The very space around him felt wrong, as though the walls themselves were closing in, shifting with unseen force. The radio crackled one last time, but the voice was no longer distorted. It was clear. Look outside. His breath hitched, his pulse racing. The voice was no longer a warning. It was an order. The ranger stood motionless, frozen in place. The door, the window, the radio, it was all pulling him in, dragging him toward the inevitable. Something wanted him to look outside. Something wanted him to see. He knew what he had to do, but he was terrified to find out what would happen if he did. Look outside. The words rang in his ears like a curse. Look outside. He stared at the door, his heart thumping painfully in his chest, each beat a countdown. His hand clutched the doorknob as though it were his only anchor to the world outside the station. Look outside. The voice had been so clear, so insistent. There was no room for hesitation now. He had to face it. He had no choice. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his body trembled with the cold sweat of terror. The radio sat on the desk, still crackling with static, the last words lingering in the air like a shadow that refused to leave. Slowly, he backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the dark window next to it. Something was out there. Something that had been watching him, and something that wanted him to look. His legs felt weak, as if the floor itself might give way beneath him. Yet, against every instinct screaming inside him, he approached the window. The glass was cool beneath his fingers as he touched it. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the thickness of the grime covering the surface. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But something was off about the way he looked. His face seemed too drawn, too gaunt. The reflection in the window. It wasn't quite right. He squinted at his own image, the edges of his face blurred by the dirt on the glass. But then something made him recoil. He hadn't moved, but his reflection seemed to shift. The eyes in the glass, they were no longer his. For a brief moment, they were too wide, darker, hollow. He gasped, stumbling backward. His heart hammered in his chest as he glanced nervously around the room. His reflection had changed, but there was no one else here. No one had moved. There was no one else. He pressed his palms against the window, willing himself to focus, to stay grounded. Then the scraping sound returned. This time, it wasn't a distant noise, it was right outside the glass. He could feel the vibration in the air as the sharp nails, or claws, scratched across the window pane, slow and deliberate. His breath hitched in his throat as the shadows around the window darkened, thickening as though they were being pulled from all sides, engulfing the edges of the glass. His hands shook uncontrollably. He didn't want to look, he didn't want to face it, but the pull was undeniable. Look outside. His fingers curled around the blinds, the fabric cold against his skin. His stomach twisted in knots, and for a brief second, he wondered if he was losing his mind. He glanced down at the radio again. No help there. No answers. Nothing but static. The claws scratched again, louder this time. A series of harsh, jagged movements that seemed to scrape at his very soul. Unable to resist, he yanked the blinds open with a swift motion. For a long moment, there was nothing but darkness outside. Then, a movement. Something slender. The figure. It was standing just outside. The window so close that its outline blurred against the glass. The silhouette was tall, impossibly tall, with long, elongated limbs that twisted at unnatural angles. It was like a shadow, but it wasn't a shadow. The darkness clung to it as though it were part of the creature itself, making it hard to focus, hard to define. It wasn't human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, the neck snapping with a sickening crack as it stared at him through the window with hollow, unblinking eyes. It knew he was watching. His breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling violently as he stumbled backward, his mind refusing to comprehend what he had just seen. The figure outside didn't move. It stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Waiting for him. A thick, low growl echoed from somewhere within the figure's body, reverberating through the glass, vibrating the air around him. It was a sound like metal scraping against stone. Unnatural. The growl was deep, resonating with a hunger that sent cold tendrils of fear crawling up his spine. But then, it blinked. The eyes, those hollow, endless eyes, blinked once, then twice. It was slow, almost too slow, like a spider preparing to strike. And in that moment, he felt something shift deep within him. The creature wasn't just looking at him, it was looking into him, it was feeling him, and it knew everything he had ever feared. The ranger backed away from the window, his heart slamming against his ribcage. Every instinct told him to run. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to flee, to escape, to get out. But the door was still stuck. The walls of the cabin were closing in. The shadows, those dark shapes in the corners of the room, seemed to be growing, pulling toward him like they were alive, hungry for his fear. The growl from outside grew louder, and for a brief moment, the ranger swore he heard it laugh, a deep, guttural sound, like a cruel echo reverberating through the cabin. It wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just some figment of his imagination. The thing outside the window was part of this place. It had been here before, and it would be here again. It was tied to the forest, to the station, to everything that had happened in these woods. Suddenly the creature moved. It was fast, too fast. Its limbs contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible as it lurched forward, its body twisting, like some grotesque marionette. The figure slammed against the glass with a sound that was half screech, half thud. The impact rattled the window, shaking the entire cabin. The figure pressed its face against the glass, its breath misting up the window in a swirl of frost, and then its lips parted, not in a smile, but something much worse. It was a slow, mocking gesture, as if savoring the terror it had caused. The air inside the cabin grew impossibly cold. His breath hung in the air, misting like smoke, and then, with an eerie slowness, the figure whispered, "You can't run." It hissed, its voice a rasping, guttural sound. It was as if the very earth beneath him trembled with the force of its words. "You are mine." The whisper lingered in the air long after the figure had spoken. It was as if the very room had absorbed the words, their chilling weight pressing down on him like a 1,000-ton stone. "You are mine." His knees gave way beneath him. The coldness in the air, the frost creeping over the edges of the glass, was suddenly overwhelming, like an icy hand clutching his chest. He gasped for breath, but the air felt too thick, too heavy. This isn't just a creature, he realized with sickening clarity. It's something older, something bound to this place. The ranger stumbled backward, his mind racing, his thoughts no longer coherent. The thing outside, the watcher, wasn't just hunting him. It was part of the land, part of the very earth itself. The station had been built on cursed ground. The mountains had been home to horrors long before human settlers arrived, and the forest had watched as each new ranger came and went. It wasn't just waiting for him. It had been waiting for all of them. He staggered to the corner of the room, clutching his chest as if trying to hold his heart together, feeling the weight of his own terror threatening to crush him. Get a grip. You can get out of this. But those thoughts were faint whispers against the rising tide of panic. His reflection in the window was still there, staring back at him with hollow eyes. The shadows seemed to grow darker with each passing moment, as if they had absorbed the creature's essence. Look outside. The words played over and over in his mind, mocking him, daring him to make the final step. The creature was still there, its dark silhouette pressed against the glass, and he could feel it pulling at him, like it was trying to reach him, not just through the window, but through the walls of his own mind. For a moment, he thought he could hear something. Not from outside, but from within. A soft murmur, low and almost indistinguishable, like a distant voice from a dream. Help me. The voice was so faint, so distant. He wasn't sure if it was real, or if his mind was breaking under the pressure. But there was something in it, something familiar. His hands trembled as he grabbed the radio again, dialing in the frequency. Please. The voice again, just a whisper. It was the voice from before. It was the other ranger. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a call for help anymore. It was a plea, a warning. He pressed the microphone to his lips, choking back the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. Who's there? His voice cracked, his own desperation bleeding through. The radio crackled in response, but no coherent words emerged, only that low, guttural growl, the growl that came from the creature outside. He could hear the rasp of its breath, the way it reverberated through the static, like a beast that hadn't tasted flesh in centuries. The growl was closer this time, almost like it was in the room with him. He turned the volume up, frantically, searching for any sign of human voice, anything that would help him understand what was happening. Please, please, don't look. The words were faint, so faint. The voice was trembling, filled with such overwhelming fear that it was impossible to ignore. The radio continued to crackle, the words breaking apart as static ate at them, but he could still hear the unmistakable dread in the voice, the previous ranger's final warning. If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside. But it was too late. He had already looked. And now the creature had him in its grasp. Not physically, not yet, but it was inside his head, inside his soul. His chest tightened, his breath shallow and erratic. The air in the room grew suffocating, oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were moving in closer. Every corner of the cabin seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the dark shapes in the room now crawling toward him, stretching and writhing like serpents in the dark. And then the walls began to bleed. Not blood, not exactly. It was darker than blood, thick and tar-like, pooling at the baseboards. The black substance seemed to ooze from the very bones of the cabin, seeping into the floor, into the walls, spreading like some kind of disease. The pungent, foul odor filled his nostrils, and he gagged as the stench suffocated him. His eyes darted around the room, his mind splintering. Was this real? Was it the creature's power? Or had he lost his mind entirely? The walls had become a grotesque mirror of the forest outside. He could almost see faces in the darkness, whispers, screams, memories of rangers who had come before him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. There was no escape, no way out. And then, the scratching. It was louder now. The claws, or whatever they were, scraping against the walls inside the cabin, as if the thing was reaching for him from every corner. The darkness thickened, moving like liquid through the room, swallowing up the floorboards and crawling toward him like some kind of sentient nightmare. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, the pressure inside his skull growing unbearable. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were warped by the creature's presence, its malevolent influence twisting his mind. It was whispering to him, promising him things, telling him things. "You're the last," it hissed, its voice coming not from the radio, but from inside his very skull, the last to fall. His mind was unraveling. It was too much terror, too much darkness. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but there was no help. He was alone in the wilderness, in the heart of this cursed station, with nothing but his fear and the watcher outside. And then he saw it, the reflection in the window. But this time, it wasn't just the creature's dark silhouette. It was him, his own reflection. It was smiling. His breath caught in his throat as he staggered backward, his legs giving way beneath him. His reflection stood in the window, grinning, a wide, horrifying grin that stretched unnaturally across his face. But it wasn't his face. It was the face of the creature. The thing outside was wearing his skin. "You are mine," it whispered again, this time not through the radio, but directly into his mind. There is no escape. The blood in his veins turned to ice. His reflection raised its hand, his hand, and slowly, deliberately, pressed against the glass. And as he looked closer, he realized the truth. The watcher wasn't outside. It had always been inside him. There is no escape. The creature's face, the twisted, grotesque reflection in the window, grinned back at him, a sickening mockery of his own. The skin of his face had been stretched too thin, the eyes wide and hollow, the mouth contorted into a smile so unnatural it made his stomach churn. The warmth of his blood felt cold as ice now, every inch of his body frozen in terror. But there was something else, something deeper within him, a tremor, not of fear, but of understanding. It had always been inside. The creature's whisper echoed in his mind, each word like a brand searing through his consciousness. "You are mine." No. The ranger stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him as he collapsed against the wall, the cabin's oppressive cold wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. His heart raced, his pulse erratic, as he fought against the pull of whatever twisted force had been leaching from the very walls of the station. His hands trembled violently as they pressed against his ears, trying to block out the voice that had seeped inside him like poison. It had been here before. It had been here, waiting. The first call, the distress signal he'd received earlier, wasn't just a warning. It was a trap, a test. It was a summons for the next victim, the next soul to be claimed. And now, he was the one it sought. Outside, the growling intensified, deepening into a guttural roar that shook the very foundations of the cabin. It wasn't the same sound. This time it felt hungry, raw. The creature's hunger wasn't just for flesh, it was for the very essence of the ranger's being. The more he resisted, the more it craved him. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was no way to fight something that was a part of him. The realization came crashing over him like a flood. It wasn't just this station that had been cursed. It was the land itself, the very mountains and forests that surrounded him. The Watcher had been there, waiting for generations. It was an ancient spirit, a presence tied to the earth, to the blood spilled over centuries of death and fear. And the Ranger? He was just the latest in a long line. With shaking hands, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the logbook. His ami. Breath caught in his throat as he flipped to the last entry. His entry. The entry that had mirrored the other Ranger's words from 5 years ago. The words were still there, scrawled across the page as though they had been written by someone else. A ghost, a shadow, a reflection of the creature itself. If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside. But the ranger had answered. He had looked. The growl outside grew louder. The sound of claws scraping against the wood of the cabin now replaced by a heavy, thudding movement. The creature had begun to circle. It was no longer waiting. It was closing in. "You are mine," it whispered again. Its voice now a chorus of voices, each one distorted, stretching across dimensions of sound. "You are the last to fall." His hand shook as the truth washed over him. There was only one way out, only one thing he could do to survive. He had to sacrifice, to give something that would sever the tie between himself and the Watcher. A soul for a soul. He had heard the stories before, but now, in the deepest pit of his terror, he understood. The creature had been feeding on the souls of rangers for centuries, and now it wanted his, the last one left. No, not this time. His heart pounded in his chest, a beat that thundered in his ears, louder and louder as he struggled to stand. The shadows around him grew heavier, more oppressive. He couldn't run. The walls were closing in. The creature was already inside him. He had to make a choice. In a final desperate act, he grabbed the radio again, holding the microphone to his lips. His voice trembled as he whispered into it, the words nearly choking him. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I've done. Don't come back. Don't answer the call." The static on the radio grew louder, a cacophony of distorted voices, and then suddenly there was silence. And in that silence, he could hear it. The Watcher's growl, closer now, pressing against the glass of the station. The ranger's reflection in the window stared back at him, but now it was different. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were his eyes, alive, filled with dread. The creature outside was growing desperate. It was straining to get in. He could hear it scraping at the door, its claws dragging against the wood, relentless. Its twisted, long fingers slipped through the cracks, but there was no way in. The cabin had been sealed. He had sealed it himself, knowing the price he had to pay. He would not leave. He could not. The price of his survival had been set. And so, the ranger made the ultimate sacrifice. He closed his eyes. The air inside the station grew thick, heavy with the weight of his final act. The frost on the window seemed to freeze in place. The air itself was suffused with something old, ancient, something that had been here long before him. He felt the creature pull at him, its claws inside his mind, its cold fingers curling around his soul. But he was ready. The walls of the cabin were alive with the whisper of old spirits, and he embraced them. They would be the final refuge. His last act was to surrender himself entirely, to break the bond between his soul and the creature's, to give up what remained of him. And just before everything went black, before the creature could pull him into the darkness, he heard one last whisper. "Thank you." The final whisper. "Thank you." And with that, the ranger is gone. His final act, a tragic, powerful sacrifice, has sealed his fate, and the creature's power has been broken for now. But the land remains cursed, the Watcher waiting in the shadows for the next soul to answer its call. The cold air inside the station never lifted, though the frost on the windows had begun to crack, sending sharp, jagged fractures through the thick layer of ice. The walls, once thick with shadows, now seemed to breathe, a slow, undulating rhythm that didn't match the pulse of the wind outside. It was as if something new had settled here, something born of the ranger's sacrifice, an unknown presence that hung in the air like smoke. The world outside remained silent, the forest and mountains eerily still, as though they had drawn back, afraid of what had just occurred within the walls of the station. The ground outside remained frozen, the air heavy, the moonlight casting an unnatural glow over the landscape. Even the wind seemed afraid to stir, yet within the ranger station the atmosphere had thickened. The station, once a cold but manageable isolation, had taken on a malevolent quality. The air was thick, saturated with something intangible, something older than the creature that had stalked him. It's not over. That was the first thought that struck the moment the last breath of life had slipped from his body. It wasn't the Watcher that was the true threat. No, the creature was just a vessel. The true horror was the land itself, the soul of the mountains, the forest, the very earth beneath his feet. The creature was tied to the park, just as the ranger was, just as all the rangers had been. The curse was not just a haunting, it was the land. And now, the Watcher had morphed. It was no longer an entity. It was a force that shifted, that wove itself into the fabric of this world and the next. The first sign of this change came as the dawn began to break, casting pale light over the snowy peaks and through the frosted windows of the ranger station. The early morning was thick with an almost oppressive quiet, but it was the soft sound of footsteps that drew the ranger's partner's attention, and yet the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. It wasn't the wind, the eye. Footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy, almost lumbering. A slow, creeping sound, like someone or something was dragging their feet through the snow, leaving deep, uneven prints in the freshly fallen powder. The footsteps circled the station, drawn in an unnatural pattern, moving deliberately from window to window. Then they stopped, right outside the ranger station's back door. Silence. And then, the unmistakable sound of scraping, a sharp, harsh noise like claws scraping against wood. But this time, it wasn't the Watcher outside. No, this sound was far worse. It wasn't a creature dragging itself. It was something far older, something far more human. Suddenly, the front door of the station creaked. The heavy door seemed to bow as though it were under pressure from something. Massive on the other side, it wasn't a knock, it was a pounding. But the pounding was muted, like a distant echo that felt too close. The ranger's partner, a woman who had recently been assigned to the station, stood frozen in the small office, a hand over her mouth, as she watched the door rattle in its frame. She wasn't new to strange occurrences. She had worked in the park long enough to have heard the tales from old rangers, the warnings passed down like folklore. But this was different. This was not some whispered tale of an old myth. This was something that bled through the cracks of the world. As the door continued to shudder, the logs in the fire pit crackled, popping like the bones of something ancient. She didn't move. She couldn't. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. It felt as though whatever was outside was not only trying to break in, it was trying to break through time itself. The door itself seemed to bend with each thud, warping in a way it should not have. The wood splintered and cracked, and through the broken slats, she saw it. A hand, but not just any hand. The fingers were long, too long, curled unnaturally, the joints snapping with every twitch. The skin was blackened, aged, as though the hand had been buried underground for centuries. It reached toward the door, scratching the cracks as though testing them, like a prisoner searching for a way out of its cage. But it wasn't the skin of the Watcher, nor was it any human form. This hand, with its grotesque fingers, was the last relic of the creature, the true force of the land itself, the one that had only pretended to be bound by the ranger's death. And it was still hungry. The silence that followed was deafening. The hand stilled. The heavy breathing on the other side of the door seemed to fade into the walls themselves. The air hung thick with dread, yet the pressure of whatever was waiting outside seemed to grow, heavier, as if it had sensed that someone had noticed. This place was never just a station. It was never just a job. It was a doorway. The door shuddered again, but this time it wasn't the pounding of the creature. This time it was the sound of movement inside the walls themselves. A rattling, a rustling, the feeling of something ancient stretching and writhing in the bones of the cabin. Something was waking up. The woman didn't know what to do. She couldn't understand how to fight this, how to run. The very air in the station thickened, the walls breathing in a way that felt like the lungs of the land itself. And then the whisper came. But this time, it was in her head. "You are the last." The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the foundations of the cabin groaning as though it was shifting toward a precipice. The whispers grew louder, blending together in a maddening chorus of voices. "You are the last." But she couldn't answer. The whispers had never stopped since the ranger's death, but now they had multiplied. The land had absorbed the sacrifice, twisted it, turned it into something more than just a ghost. She turned to the radio, her hands shaking as she grabbed the receiver. Her heart raced as she punched in the frequency. "Help. Please." Her voice cracked, her words trembling in the thick, suffocating air. The only sound that answered her was a slow, deliberate breath. Then the faintest crackle of the static. Then she heard it. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I've done. Don't come back. Don't answer the call." It was the last thing she heard before the cabin's walls seemed to close in on her, the crushing weight of the land finally overwhelming her. The radio died, and outside the hand on the door slowly stretched. "You are the last." And with this, the story deepens further into the heart of the curse. The woman's discovery has unearthed more than she bargained for. The station isn't just haunted, it is a conduit, a focal point for the dark forces of the land. As the last to enter, she has unknowingly sealed her fate. Will she make the same choices as the ranger? Or will she find a way to break the cycle? The land itself was awake now, restless and ravenous. Beneath the layers of snow and the quiet, pristine forests, something ancient stirred, like the rumbling of the earth itself, shaking with the memory of centuries of death, grief, and forgotten sacrifices. Inside the ranger station, the woman, stricken with the weight of the entity's presence, fumbled with the radio in her hands, her body numb with fear. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as she pressed the receiver to her lips once more. Her heart pounded in her chest, a beat she could feel in the walls. But the radio crackled and hissed. No answer, no guidance. The darkness outside pressed against the glass, its very presence suffocating. Her fingers gripped the receiver tighter, but the static was overwhelming now, blurring the line between sanity and madness. And then, through the buzzing storm of static, a voice. It was faint, like a memory. It was almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. "Help me." The words were barely audible. They were a scream swallowed by time, the voice distorted by the airwaves, and yet the woman knew. She had heard those words before. "Who is this?" Her voice cracked. Was it him, the other ranger, the one who had left the cryptic message in the logbook 5 years ago? The same one whose last words had haunted her? The voice on the radio answered. It was soft but desperate. "I can't move. It's here." Her stomach dropped. The voice was his. It was the same call, the same plea. She could feel her pulse quicken, her throat dry as dust. No. This couldn't be happening. The ranger had died. He had made his sacrifice. The last entry in the logbook had confirmed it. The static grew louder, louder, until it filled her ears entirely, like the buzzing of 1,000 flies. The voice faltered, broken by the jagged noise. But then, through the chaos, one word stood out, unmistakable. "It's inside." The radio flickered and popped, and then it fell silent. The cabin felt suffocating now, the air thick with unseen pressure. Outside, the wind began to howl, but not in the natural way of a mountain breeze. No, this was different, too different. The wind screamed against the walls, a banshee wail that rattled the windows, as if something from beyond was testing its hold. The very foundation of the cabin seemed to groan under the weight of it. The shadows inside the station had taken on a life of their own, crawling along the walls like fingers reaching for the woman. She could feel their cold presence creeping down her spine, their chilling breath brushing against her skin. The cabin had become a tomb, a place where the air itself was stained with centuries of lost souls. The whisper came again. Not from the radio this time, but from inside the walls. You are the last. The last. The words were both a threat and a promise. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the overturned chair as she moved toward the window. Her eyes darted toward the frosted glass, her breath fogging up the panes. She could see nothing. The night had swallowed everything whole. No movement, no life, just the silent weight of the land pressing down. Yet there was something out there. She couldn't explain it, but the cold from outside seemed to push its way through the very air in the room. The frost had formed strange patterns on the glass, twisting in ways that made her feel as though the very earth beneath her feet was pulling at her. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, a slow, deliberate knock. It was not the wind. The woman froze, her hand still gripping the edge of the table as the knock sounded again, then a third time, and each time the knock grew louder, harder, more desperate. She swallowed, her throat dry. She had to get out of there. She had to leave before whatever had claimed the ranger found her. But her legs felt heavy, as if the very floor was holding her in place. The urge to move was swallowed by the terror in her chest, and for a moment she stood paralyzed, caught between two realities, the old ranger's fate and the horrifying unknown that was coming for her now. The knock came again. This time, she could feel it. The door was breathing. The land was alive. The very wood seemed to shudder, groaning with an ancient life of its own. The woman stumbled forward, her hand stretching toward the door, feeling the heat radiating from it, despite the cold that had overtaken the room. Before she could reach the handle, the door slammed open with a force that rattled the entire cabin. The woman was thrown backward, crashing into the chair behind her. She gasped, her heart seizing as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide in disbelief. Through the open door, she saw nothing but the trees, the endless dark woods stretching out before her. The night had deepened, but it was the woods that held her attention. The trees, gnarled and twisted, stood in perfect stillness. Their branches reached toward the sky like the fingers of ancient forgotten gods. And there, just beyond the threshold of the station, a figure. At first, she thought it was a shadow. But no, it was much more than that. The figure was hunched, its body covered in tattered, ragged cloth. It wore no face, only a dark void where its head should have been. The figure's body writhed and shifted as though it could never be still, always moving. But there was no sound. The woman took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. It was the Watcher. It had finally found her. "It's not over, you know," the voice whispered. But it didn't come from the figure. It came from the very ground beneath her feet. The woman stumbled backward, her eyes wide in terror as she realized the truth. The Watcher had never been a creature. It was the land itself. The ancient force had morphed, and now it had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. It wasn't seeking one soul, it was seeking all of them, and with each new sacrifice, the land grew stronger. The Watcher, now more than just a beast, stepped forward, its long fingers stretching toward her soul. The woman could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She could not escape the grasp of the land. Her voice, hoarse from the terror, barely escaped her lips. "What do you want from me?" But the Watcher didn't answer. It didn't need to. The answer was in the land, in the echo of its ancient hunger. It had always been watching, and now it was waiting for its final sacrifice. The echo of the land. As the darkness closes in, the woman realizes the horrifying truth. The Watcher is not just a being, but a force that has always existed. Within the land itself, the sacrifices are not just about feeding, it's about maintaining the balance, and this force must never be allowed to rest. With every soul it claims, it grows stronger. She is the last to enter this cycle, but will she be the last to fall? The air in the cabin was thick now, saturated with the smell of damp earth, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the moisture from the forest outside. But the smell wasn't just soil, it was decay, the scent of ancient rot that had been buried beneath layers of snow, forgotten by time, only to surface now in the most grotesque of forms. The station itself groaned like an old, dying animal, its bones creaking under the weight of something far too old to be contained within these walls. The Watcher stood at the door, its form more than just a figure now. It was the forest. Its body was a mesh of gnarled roots and twisted branches, moving in and out of the shadows, shifting with an unnatural fluidity. The ragged cloth that hung from its frame fluttered like torn leaves in the wind, though there was no breeze. Its face, or rather the absence of one, seemed to pull her gaze in as if it was drawing her into that void, that endless, suffocating darkness that stretched farther than the eye could see. She knew without a doubt that it wasn't just here to take her. It was waiting for her to choose. Her hands shook, the radio still in her grasp. But the static on the device was no longer chaotic. It was purposeful. A rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of the land itself, reverberated through the small cabin. With each crackle of the static, she felt it grow stronger. The Watcher wasn't just tied to the forest anymore, it was tied to her. And it was waiting for her to make the ultimate decision. The land had been hungry, desperate for more, but it wasn't the creatures of the woods that fed it. No, it was the rangers, the caretakers, the watchers of the park, who had unknowingly fed it for centuries, and now it was her turn. "Please, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the static. The words felt too small, too weak for the horror that had surrounded her. The Watcher moved, its shape becoming more solid as it took a step toward her. Each movement it made caused the walls to groan, as though the entire station was shuddering at its presence. The door slammed shut behind it, cutting off her only escape. She was trapped, cornered, and the creature before her was not a beast. It wasn't a demon or a ghost. It was a force, a reflection of the land's insatiable hunger. The Watcher had never been alive. It had always existed. It was an extension of the land itself, growing and shifting with each passing century, always taking, always needing. The woman's breath came in short bursts, each inhale stinging her lungs. She could feel the weight of the air pressing against her chest, as though the land itself was squeezing the life from her. The ground under her feet seemed to pulse, a steady throb that resonated in her bones. The Watcher tilted its head as if considering her. Its form swayed, limbs twisting unnaturally, the tree-like tendrils that hung from its body rattling like chains. And then it spoke. The voice, low and guttural, was not of any language the woman knew, but the meaning was clear. The Watcher didn't need words to communicate. It spoke through the very fabric of the land, through the pulse beneath her feet. But this time its message was plain. "You are the last." She stumbled back, her legs shaking beneath her. "What do you want from me?" Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked with fear. The creature didn't answer at first, but the static grew louder, the crackling hiss rising to a deafening roar. Her head was spinning as the walls of the station seemed to melt into the forest outside. It was like she could see the trees stretching toward her, their dark branches curling like fingers reaching for her skin. The Watcher wasn't just a creature of the land, it was the land itself, and it was inside her, feeding off her fear, her confusion. She could feel its eyes, if they existed, on her, watching, just as it always had. The radio crackled again, and this time, it wasn't the Watcher that spoke. It was the voice of the dead ranger, the one who had gone before her. "You can't escape it. No one can. The land chooses. It has always chosen." Her heart stopped. The message, the same message she had heard so many times before, echoed through her mind, a terrible truth that reverberated deep into her soul. The park had claimed the rangers. One by one, it had consumed them, leaving only their echoes behind. The logbook, the radio transmissions, the warnings left behind. Those were not just messages from the past. They were the voices of those who had been taken. They had not been killed by the creature. They had been absorbed into the land, swallowed by the ancient force that lay beneath it. The land was alive. The land was watching. The land would never stop, and the land wanted her. The truth crushed her chest. She staggered back, hands gripping her throat, as if she could push the words out, as if she could deny them. But she couldn't. It was too late. The Watcher moved toward her, its tendrils reaching. The cold air swirled around her, sharp like knives against her skin, but it was not the cold she feared. It was the silence that followed, the absence of noise, the absence of air. It was the land drawing in its breath, preparing for the final sacrifice. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She was trapped in a cycle, an endless loop. The Watcher was not the end. The Watcher was the beginning. The Watcher was the land, and the land had always been watching. There was a final moment of clarity, a brief understanding of the horrific choice that lay before her. She could fight. She could scream. But it wouldn't matter. The sacrifice had already been made. She was already part of it. The Watcher reached out, its branches now fully extended, their razor-sharp edges glistening in the fading light. She could feel its cold presence inside her, in her mind, in her soul. The land had already begun to consume her, and in this moment she realized that she was never meant to survive. The land would claim her, just as it had claimed the others before her, and the curse would continue forever. With a final, shuddering breath, she closed her eyes, and then everything went black. The land chooses. And so the woman becomes just another echo, another voice that will linger in the static, a part of the land that will never die. The cycle continues, and the land waits, patient, for the next Watcher, the next sacrifice. The Watcher is not just an entity, it is an eternal force, tied to the mountains, to the woods, to the very soul of the land itself. But what of the land's endless hunger? What of the next one to arrive? The night had swallowed everything whole. The cabin, once a safe haven from the biting cold and isolation of the Rockies, now stood as a hollow tomb in the deepening winter. Its walls, stained by the presence of something ancient and malevolent, seemed to hum with an energy that wasn't quite of this world. The land, hungry and waiting, had claimed another. But it wasn't just the woman who was taken. The Watcher had not been satisfied with her soul alone. It had fed on everything. She was her fear, her memories, her breath, and now her silence. But the cycle never truly ends. Out in the woods, deep beneath the dark canopy, the trees began to shift. The moonlight filtered weakly through the branches, but it barely touched the snow. Everything around it felt too cold, too far. There was no warmth, no light that could push away the oppressive darkness that settled over the land. This forest, these mountains, had always been more than just a backdrop to the rangers' lives. They were the foundation of something much more terrifying. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a crunching boot against snow echoed, a new presence. The land had claimed another soul, another ranger. He had arrived. His name was Jesse, a young man fresh to the job, unaware of the horrors that had been woven into the very soil he had sworn to protect. His excitement at the prospect of a quiet night shift in one of the country's most beautiful parks had quickly turned to dread when he first checked into the station and found the woman's last transmission. He had read the logbook, but there was nothing in it that could have prepared him for what he was about to face. Jesse stood at the cabin door, staring into the black void of the night, his breath fogging in the cold air. He felt something, someone, watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. His hand lingered near the door handle, as if some invisible force was tugging at him, pulling him into the silence that waited beyond. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the station's darkened interior. The faintest slivers of moonlight managed to slip through the frost-covered windows, casting elongated, twisted shadows across the floor. Jesse hesitated. "Hello?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the vast emptiness. But there was no answer. No response. He stepped in, his boots heavy on the floorboards, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. His eyes scanned the room, the faint, lingering echoes of the woman's presence still hanging in the air. He moved slowly, carefully, as though something might leap out from the shadows, clawing for his soul. The radio, still on the table, was caked in frost, the static pulsing eerily in the otherwise dead room. Had she really heard something on the radio? Jesse's fingers brushed against the receiver. The faintest touch, but it was enough to send a ripple of cold up his spine. His breath caught. For a brief moment, he thought he heard a voice, a soft, strangled whisper coming from the radio's crackling speakers. "It's here," Jesse recoiled, his pulse racing. His heart beat faster, more erratically now, as he looked around the room again. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious traces of anything sinister. But the unease gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. He looked at the logbook on the counter. It was open to the last entry. Her entry. The woman's handwritten, words scribbled in a hurried hand. "If you hear it, don't answer. Don't look outside." The words were like a rope, pulling him deeper into the pit of terror. She had heard the same voice, the same cries. The watcher's hunger hadn't been sated by her sacrifice, but had instead been passed on like a plague to him. The air shifted. Jesse froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't just the cold, it was something else, something deeper, something that had been waiting. A sound, faint but unmistakable, echoed from outside, a soft, rhythmic knocking on the door. It was the same knock. Jesse's blood ran cold. His eyes darted to the door, his body rigid with fear. There was a sickening, heavy feeling in the pit of his stomach. The land had a pattern. The watcher's hunger followed a cycle, and it was closing in on him now. The knocking grew louder, faster, and with it, the static from the radio intensified, almost in time with the noise. It was a pulse, a rhythm that hummed through the ground beneath his feet. Jesse wanted to turn and run, to leave, to scream. But something held him there. The door creaked open on its own, as if guided by an unseen hand, and through the crack he saw it. The Watcher. It was closer now, standing just beyond the threshold, its form more solid than before. The twisted branches that made up its body groaned, snapping and shifting as it moved. The tendrils that made up its limbs reached forward, as though beckoning him to step out into the forest. The woman's warnings echoed in his mind. "It's here. Don't answer." But he couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the ground. "Help me," the watcher's voice rasped, though it was not the voice of a man, but something far older, far darker. The sound was like the rumble of the earth, itself a low growl that vibrated through his bones. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. He had seen the logbook. He had read the warnings. He knew what this creature wanted. And yet still he felt a pull. Something compelling him forward, out of the cabin, into the forest. The Watcher was not a creature that lived in the world of men. It was a force, a primal hunger that needed him. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The Watcher didn't speak, but it didn't need to. Its tendrils reached for him with a terrifying speed, wrapping around his legs, pulling him toward the door. The dark void of its face flickered in the shadows like an endless, shifting black hole. The door slammed shut behind him, and for the first time Jesse understood the curse. The land did not need individuals. It needed the Watcher, the one who could see, the one who could protect, the one who could be taken. The land had claimed him just as it had claimed the others. There was no escape, only the endless cycle of sacrifice, where the Watcher would continue forever and ever, the next Watcher. And so Jesse became part of the forest, his body, his soul, absorbed by the land that had never been truly dead. The Watcher was not just a beast. It was the land itself, an ancient entity that fed on the souls of those who dared to protect it. He would be forgotten in time, just as the others had been, his essence forever part of the unyielding earth beneath the park. But soon there would be another. The land would always demand more. Jesse's body, stiff and cold, lay in the center of the clearing, the frost beginning to form around his limbs. His eyes were wide open, staring into the black abyss above, but there was no awareness in them. His soul, his essence, had already been consumed, taken by the land, and now only his body remained, a vessel for the Watcher's endless hunger. The forest stood still around him, as if holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, the howling wind carried the faintest whispers of a voice, soft, fleeting and haunting. It sounded familiar. No, it can't be. The woman's voice, her spirit, whispered through the pines, a reminder that she too was once the Watcher. She had become part of the land, her sacrifice having fed the forest just as Jesse's would. She was not dead. She was simply gone. But the land had always known what was needed. The trees stirred as if responding to some unseen command, their limbs creaking and groaning under the weight of ancient forces. The Watcher stood at the edge of the clearing, its monstrous shape twisting in the night, as if in an eternal dance with the darkness. Its branches scraped the sky, their twisted forms reaching out like claws, hungry, relentless. And yet, it was still. It waited. There was a pull, a gravitational force that Jesse could not resist, no matter how hard he fought against it. The land had claimed him as it had done with all those before him. But the question remained, why had the Watcher chosen him? What had it seen in him? Was he just another pawn in an eternal game of sacrifice? Or was there something deeper at play? The woman's voice called again, echoing through the cold night air. It chooses every time. Jesse closed his eyes, his heartbeat quickening. He had to escape. He had to fight. He had read the logbook. He had read the warnings. You can't escape it, Jesse. Don't look outside and don't answer. But the compulsion to step out into the darkness to face the Watcher was overwhelming. Why? The Watcher had no face. It had no eyes. And yet, somehow, Jesse knew that it could see him. It had always been watching, always waiting for the next one to come, and that's when it hit him. The Watcher had been waiting for him. The land had always been a place of shadows, a place of secrets. But Jesse now understood its true nature. This was not just a curse, it was a pact. An ancient deal forged in blood and soil between something far older than any human could comprehend. A force that had been born from the earth itself. The Watcher was not merely a monster, it was the land's will made manifest. And it wasn't looking for victims, it was looking for witnesses. The Watcher needed someone who could see the truth, someone who could recognize the unbroken cycle of sacrifice that had begun centuries ago. Someone who could understand that the land had been alive from the very first moment the Rangers set foot here. The forest had no intention of letting go. It was eternal. The land was always watching, always in need of someone to take the role of the Watcher. And so the Watcher chose. It had chosen Jesse, just as it had chosen the woman before him. They were all part of the land now. Each of them was a guardian, a keeper, a sacrifice. But more than that, they were the reflection of the land's hunger. Jesse had understood too late. He had been pulled in by the whispers, the static on the radio, the desperation of the woman's final words. But in his last moments, he knew the truth. The Watcher wasn't just a monster. The Watcher was the land. The land was both the predator and the prey. It had fed on the Rangers for centuries, but it could only continue so long as the Watchers were willing to serve. Every cycle had a price that grew with each passing year, until the land could not sustain itself without a new witness to its eternal hunger. Jesse stood now on the threshold between life and death, his spirit torn. He could feel it, the pull of the land dragging him down deeper into its heart. But still, the choice remained. Would he, like all the others, become one with the land? Or could he break the curse that had been placed upon this sacred ground? He turned his gaze toward the Watcher. Its branches trembled as if it too felt the weight of the decision. And then, with an agonizing wrench, Jesse understood the true nature of the sacrifice. A sharp, shrill cry tore through the air, cutting through the frozen silence of the night. A figure appeared from the shadows, the woman. Her form was ghostly, her presence barely a whisper in the cold wind. But there she stood, her eyes wide with a look of sorrow and determination. She had been the Watcher before him. She had been claimed by the land, her essence now interwoven with it. But still, she had a choice. In her final breath, she had understood what Jesse was now realizing. She had been both a witness and a victim, and now she would give him the same choice. Break the cycle, her voice whispered, filled with the weight of centuries. Or let it claim you too. Jesse's heart raced. There was no escape. The land always won. But as the Watcher's tendrils reached out for him, he made his decision. With every ounce of strength, he shouted into the air, "I refuse!" And in that moment, the Watcher paused. The forest held its breath. A surge of power, old and primal, rippled through the ground beneath him, shaking the earth itself. The trees twisted and groaned, their bark splitting open like the skin of some ancient, monstrous creature. The Watcher's limbs curled inward, writhing with the fury of ages past. The Watcher's choice. Jesse stood, heart pounding, as the Watcher loomed before him. The land had chosen him. But could he choose something else? Could he break the endless cycle? The trees around him began to warp, their forms shifting between human and animal, twisting into monstrous shapes. The Watcher was not a creature of flesh. It was a creature of will. And Jesse had made his choice. But the land had its own too. The air grew heavier with every breath Jesse took. It was as though the forest was exhaling, its very lungs filled with a suffocating darkness that threatened to choke him. The trees groaned, and the ground beneath his feet trembled, as though the land itself were alive, aware of his defiance, of the choice he had made. The Watcher loomed before him, its form twisting and shifting, and in that shifting, it revealed something Jesse had not yet seen. The Watcher was not a single creature. It was a collective, a host of countless souls woven into the fabric of the land. The twisted, grotesque limbs, the crackling branches, the hollow, faceless figure. It was only the body. The true essence of the Watcher was the voices of those who had fallen before. They whispered in unison. "You cannot escape what is already written," they chanted. Their voices a chorus of pain and regret, each syllable a prayer for release that had never come. The land is eternal. It will always demand, always claim. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a drum of war. He could feel it, the pull, that magnetic force trying to drag him into the ground. The Watcher was its will, its reflection. The entity fed on the witnesses, the ones who had come to the land, trying to protect it, only to become part of it. His fingers clenched into fists, his breath quick and shallow. He had read the logbook. He had seen the woman's last entry. She had tried to warn him, but there was more. There was always more. This wasn't just about survival. It was about acceptance. For a moment, Jesse felt the despair flood him, overwhelming, threatening to pull him under. Was it really possible to break this cycle? Could any of them escape? Could he escape? The Watcher's tendrils reached out, writhing through the air, pulsing with energy. He could feel their icy grip wrapping around his legs, pulling him forward, inch by inch, closer to its ravenous embrace. But then something shifted. A whisper, faint but clear, pierced the air. Fight. It was her. The woman, the one who had been the Watcher before him. She was here, in the air, in the very forest itself. Her spirit had never truly left. She had been trapped here, just as the Watcher had been, but she had never stopped fighting. Now, her presence had returned to guide him, to show him the truth. Jesse's hands trembled as he reached for the earth. He could feel the cold soil, the ancient pulse of the land beneath him. For the first time since his arrival, he realized the land was not just a place, it was a prison that fed on the souls of those who dared to venture into it, to protect it. And yet somehow, in the silence of that night, Jesse understood something deeper. The land could be freed. In one final, desperate push, Jesse thrust his hands into the ground, his fingers digging deep into the soil. The Watcher screamed, a guttural, primal sound that shook the trees. The branches of the forest trembled violently, the very air around him crackling with energy. The whispers, the voices, grew louder. They were no longer pleas for release. They were angry. The spirits trapped in the Watcher's form screamed, cursed, and raged at him. "Let us go," they cried in unison. "End the curse." With everything he had, Jesse clenched his eyes shut and pushed deeper into the earth, summoning the strength from the land itself. It was his last chance. He could feel the Watcher's power, the force of the forest's hunger, trying to pull him in, trying to twist his soul into its endless cycle. But Jesse would not let it. He shouted into the night, his voice hoarse, raw, with emotion. "I will break you." The ground beneath him shuddered. The trees twisted, their roots tearing through the earth as if in agony. The Watcher howled in fury, but Jesse's resolve did not falter. In that moment, something miraculous happened. The earth answered. The trees began to bend away from him. The Watcher's form flickered, as though something was tearing it apart from within. The branches crumbled, the limbs snapping, the bark splintering as if it were made of brittle wood. The land itself recoiled, releasing the grip it had held for centuries, and in the midst of it all, the woman's voice echoed one final time, clear and full of purpose. "You have set us free." Jesse fell back onto the ground, gasping for breath, the weight of the land's oppression lifting from his chest. The night air was still, the oppressive darkness that had hung over the forest now gone. The howling wind was no longer a mournful cry. There was peace, real peace, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The Watcher was gone. The land was no longer hungry, but it had come at a price. Jesse's body felt drained, as though the land had taken its own toll. The woods, though silent now, seemed to whisper something else, a promise, a warning, a future that could still remain uncertain. In the distance, beyond the trees, Jesse could see the first rays of dawn beginning to break through the horizon, casting a pale golden light over the snow-covered forest. He had won, but the land, even in its newfound stillness, still had its secrets, and in the distance, the faintest sound of footsteps on snow reached his ears. The next Watcher was already coming. Cliffhanger, the Watcher's return. Jesse turned to look toward the horizon, his breath quickening. He had freed the land, but in doing so, he knew the cycle had only been interrupted, not ended. The land would always call out for a Watcher, and one day, another would answer. The question wasn't whether it would come, it was who would be next. Final reflection, and so ends the tale of the Watcher. But the land's hunger has not been quelled forever. The echoes of this ancient pact still linger in the hearts of those who step into its grasp. For the land of the Rockies is both a prison and a home, a place that feeds on the souls of those brave enough or desperate enough to defend it. The Watcher may be gone, but the cycle is endless. Perhaps it's always been that way. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The sky had begun to sink into an inky darkness as the group of 5 paddled their kayaks to the riverbank. The rhythmic splash of their paddles, the only sound in the thick evening air. They had been in the Nantahala National Forest for hours, fighting the strong current and steering their kayaks around large rocks jutting out of the river. They had made no plans to stop, only to paddle, to feel the pulse of the water beneath them, until they reached the small, remote clearing that they'd mapped out weeks earlier. It was a place far enough from civilization that they could escape everything. The dense trees that lined the riverbank were thick with foliage, blocking out the stars that would have normally been visible in the open sky. In their place, the sound of rustling branches and the distant hoot of an owl created a blanket of quiet. The forest felt heavy, thick, as though it had been holding its breath for centuries, waiting for something. The only things visible beyond. The trees were shadows that stretched like twisted fingers into the abyss of the underbrush. Jake, the de facto leader of the group, was the first to break the silence. He motioned toward a flat patch of land on the riverbank, an area that had been marked with the remnants of a long-gone campsite. It was a good spot. An excellent spot, actually. It was completely isolated, a place they could set up their tents and fire without concern of being disturbed. "Here's good," he said, turning his paddle to steer toward the bank. His voice sounded like an echo muffled by the forest around them. His sunburned face was hidden under a worn baseball cap, and his bright blue life jacket stood out against the otherwise subdued colors of the forest. Liam, a lean figure with dark hair, was the next to land his kayak, followed by Sarah and Emily. Josh, the quietest of the group, brought up the rear, a little slower but no less eager to get the camp set up. They unloaded their gear in the dimming light, the forest closing in around them like a living thing. The crackle of twigs beneath their feet, the murmur of the river, a constant undercurrent to their actions, was all they could hear. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the world was holding its breath. While they worked, setting up tents and unwrapping food, Emily, the soft-spoken one, glanced over at the still water. It mirrored the sky, perfectly still, its glassy surface only broken by the occasional ripple from the current. She tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but the thought clung to her. Something about the way the trees stood so still, how the river seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it were just waiting for something. She wasn't sure what, but her gut told her this place didn't belong to them. Everything good with the tents? Jake's voice cut through her thoughts, and she blinked, shaking her head slightly to clear the unease. Yeah, Emily replied, her voice a little too high-pitched. Just feels strange here, doesn't it? Sarah, who was busy stirring a pot of beans over the fire, glanced up at her. Strange, she repeated, a wry smile creeping onto her face. It's just a little remote, that's all. Come on, it's perfect. Liam joined in, his voice teasing. Yeah, Emily. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? There's nobody around for miles. Yeah, unless a bear decides to show. Up, Josh muttered from where he was unloading his pack, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. He had a dry sense of humor that kept things light, but even his tone seemed a little darker tonight, his shoulders hunched, as though he was preparing for something. The air felt heavy, thick, with something unspoken. They set up the fire in a small pit, the orange glow lighting their faces with its warmth. The smell of burning wood filled the air, and the chirp of insects was deafening as night settled in, taking over the forest. By now, the river had quieted to almost nothing, and all that remained was the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of leaves. The tension that had once hovered over the camp now felt like it had settled into the very ground beneath their feet. The conversation turned to small talk, the usual banter that accompanies the stillness of the night. They joked about their failed attempts to cook the beans, laughed at Liam's snarky remarks, and shared stories about past kayaking trips, none of them particularly remarkable. But with each word, the air seemed to grow heavier, more constricting. Emily stared into the fire, the flames dancing and leaping with an unnatural intensity. For a moment, she thought she saw something move, just beyond the trees on the other side of the river, a shadow, something tall, but when she blinked, it was gone. It was nothing. She told herself that, but still, her heart was racing. Across from her, Liam shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Did anyone hear that?" he asked, his voice unusually tense. "Hear what?" Jake replied, sitting back, his face illuminated by the fire's flickering light. Liam shook his head slowly. "I swear I heard something. A whistle. Across the river." Emily straightened, narrowing her eyes toward the dark riverbank, the trees thick with shadows. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't heard it, but she suddenly felt as though the forest around them was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Probably just a bird," Sarah said, a little too quickly, and for a moment no one spoke. But then, there it was again, a sharp, shrill whistle, thin and sharp, slicing through the heavy silence of the night, echoing across the river. It was almost musical, the sort of whistle you might hear from a distant camper or wanderer. Jake was the first to respond. He turned his head, squinting, across the riverbank into the thick forest that was just barely visible in the dim light. "Hello!" he called out, raising his voice above the fire's crackling. "Anyone out there?" The whistle came again, so identical to Jake's call that it sent a cold shiver down his spine. Did you hear that?" Emily whispered. "It's got to be someone messing with us," Josh said, his tone light, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Maybe another camper on the other side." They waited in tense silence. The only sound now the faint echo of the whistle, identical in every way to their own. It was as if someone had copied their exact call. "Let's give them a response," Jake said, clearing his throat, his voice trying to sound casual, but it was tight. He leaned forward. "On three, 1, 2, 3, they whistled back. The exact same high-pitched, sharp note that had sounded across the river. And then, there it was. The whistle came again, precisely the same as their own. Down to the second, down to the exact pitch. It was as if the person on the other side of the river was standing right next to them, mimicking their movements with an eerie precision. They all turned to look at one another, eyes wide. "That's..." Jake started, his voice trailing off. "Too perfect," Liam finished for him, his tone heavy with uncertainty. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah's gaze flicked nervously between the fire and the dark riverbank. The sounds of the forest felt muffled, distant. There was a strange, almost suffocating stillness hanging in the air, and the soft rustle of branches seemed to amplify the sense of something wrong. Jake grabbed the flashlight by his side and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees on the opposite shore, illuminating nothing but shadow. The forest, still and silent, offered no answers. "Maybe it's an echo," Sarah said, though there was a tremor in her voice now. "It's gotta be," but the whistling continued, each call perfectly timed, mirroring their own to an unsettling degree. As the seconds dragged on, the whistling took on a new, sinister tone, a mocking repetition that set their nerves on edge. "Let's just get some sleep," Jake said, his voice tight with forced calm. "We'll deal with this in the morning." But as they began to retreat to their tents, the feeling that they were not alone, that something was out there in the forest watching them, gnawed at each of them like an insidious thought. And then, just as they were about to settle in for the night, came another sound, splashing. Soft at first, a gentle ripple in the water, and then louder, closer. It was as if someone, was crossing the river toward them. But the sound, it didn't match the usual nocturnal noises of the forest. This wasn't the splash of an animal. It was deliberate, slow, and it was coming closer. The splashing came again, closer, louder, like something moving through the water, making its way toward their camp. The sound was slow and deliberate. Each stroke of whatever creature or thing was crossing the river, echoing through the night air. It wasn't the frantic splash of an animal trying to cross. No, this was methodical, measured, heavy. Jake's hand froze on the zipper of his tent, his body tense, every muscle straining to listen. The others had stopped moving as well, their eyes wide in the dim glow of their lanterns, each of them straining to hear the unmistakable sound, the soft splash of water, step after step. Emily was the first to speak. "Do you think it's someone, a person?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like a shout in the fragile silence of the forest. Jake turned toward the riverbank, eyes darting, but the darkness on the opposite side swallowed everything. It was too thick, too black. No figure moved in the shadows. "Who would be out here?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly, the attempt at humor failing in her tone. "It's so far off the beaten path." The splashing continued, each stroke longer than the last, a rhythm of deliberate movement through the water. The firelight flickered weakly, as though even the flames themselves were beginning to feel the presence creeping up from the river. Liam stood, his body coiled with tension. He was the first to break from the frozen group. "I'll check it out," he said, voice low but firm. His hand gripped the flashlight in his pocket, but even as he reached for it, doubt gnawed at him. His legs felt leaden, the air thick, almost suffocating. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, but the curiosity, mixed with fear, compelled him forward. "Liam, wait!" Jake hissed, but it was too late. Liam had already stepped away from the fire, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. The others watched in silence as Liam moved toward the edge of the clearing. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth along the opposite riverbank. The river lay still now, the only movement the occasional ripple from the soft, deliberate splashes that continued in the distance. For a moment, there was nothing, just Liam's light trembling in the dark as he scanned the forest across the river. But then, there it was again. A whistle. Not the sharp, distant one from earlier, but a new one, closer, louder, a perfect, unnerving mimicry of Liam's own whistle from moments before. It was identical, the same pitch, the same duration. Liam froze, his breath hitched, and the flashlight wavered in his hand. He glanced back at the others, but their faces were masked with the same confusion and growing fear. "Liam!" Emily's voice was hoarse now, barely above a whisper, but Liam didn't answer. Instead, he took a hesitant step toward the water's edge. His boots sank into the damp earth as he crouched low, trying to peer into the black void across the river. The sound of splashing grew louder, closer still. Whatever was in the water was near the opposite bank now, and the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the splashing stopped. Complete and total silence. The sudden stillness was deafening, as though the forest itself had been suffocated. Liam straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. The flashlight's beam swept back and forth across the dark, but he saw nothing. There were no shapes in the trees, no figure. Emerging from the river, just a void, blackness. "Liam, get back here!" Jake called again, his voice strained with urgency. Reluctantly, Liam turned and began to walk back toward the fire. He didn't speak as he approached the group. The same confusion and fear etched into his face. His eyes wide and searching. Scanned the opposite bank one last time, but there was nothing to see, nothing to explain the unnerving whistling. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, stepping closer to Liam, her hand trembling. Liam swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "I don't know. There was nothing over there. But it sounded like someone was whistling right back at me. Same exact sound, same timing." Jake's gaze flicked between the water and the forest beyond. The fire crackled loudly in the sudden quiet, but his thoughts were far away, swirling with unease. "This isn't right. No one else should be out here." The others nodded, but there was no comfort in their agreement. They had been alone when they first arrived, and the idea that someone else had wandered out into the middle of nowhere seemed impossible. The feeling of being watched settled over them again, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on their chests. "Maybe we're just hearing things," Josh muttered, though his voice wavered slightly. "We've been out here for hours. It's probably just the wind or some damn animal." But even as he said it, none of them believed him. They all felt it. The suffocating tension in the air, the oppressive silence of the trees, the sense that something unseen had been watching them the entire time. The fire flickered, its warm glow doing little to stave off the chill that had crept into their bones. Suddenly, without warning, the whistle came again. Only this time, it wasn't from across the river. It came from behind them. All five of them whirled around, heartbeats crashing in their ears. Their flashlights swept wildly through the trees, but there was nothing there. The air was still, the forest silent. "What the hell?" Emily gasped, her voice trembling. The whistle came again, closer now, almost too close, and then another sound joined it, the unmistakable rhythmic splashing of water, cutting through the night like a blade. "Something's in the river," Jake said hoarsely. His voice was tight, constricted with dread. Liam stepped back, his eyes flicking to the water, the trees. His stomach churned as he realized they were being circled. Whatever was out there was moving, deliberate and slow, just beyond their reach. drawing closer with each moment. The splashing was louder now, unmistakable. Something was crossing the river again, but this time it wasn't on the far side. This time, it was closer, almost too close. "Stay near the fire," Jake said, his voice hard as he pulled the flashlight back toward the bank. The beam trembled in his hand as the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker. Emily took a deep breath and clutched her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The air had grown colder still, the chill seeping into her skin, and the silence that followed. Each splash made her blood run cold. Then another sound, a footstep, wet, heavy, unmistakable. It was in their camp now. From the darkness of the trees behind them, something stepped into the light of the fire. Something tall, cloaked in shadow. It had no face. The figure emerged from the trees with the slow, deliberate pace of something that had no need to rush. Its shape, though obscured by shadow, was tall, unnaturally tall. The dim firelight flickered on the edges of its form, but it seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally, as if the very light itself was hesitant to touch it. It did not move like a person. It glided, its form fluid, as though its feet did not quite touch the ground. The air around them grew colder still, a biting chill that stung their skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The splashing in the water ceased altogether, but the oppressive silence that followed felt more suffocating than anything they had experienced before. The trees themselves seemed to lean in closer, their branches bending like long, bony fingers reaching toward the clearing. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "What the hell is that?" None of them answered. Their eyes locked on the figure now standing just at the edge of the firelight, a shape so impossibly still it seemed to be made of shadows. Liam's hand tightened around the flashlight, his knuckles white, but the beam of light trembled in his grip. He couldn't seem to make it focus. The thing standing before them had no discernible face, no features, just a dark void where its face should have been, as though its skin was a layer of thick, hollow blackness. Its limbs, too long, too angular, moved unnaturally, as if they were both too rigid and too fluid, stretching unnervingly as it took another step forward. "Is that a person?" Emily's voice cracked, barely a whisper, but the fear in it was palpable. Sarah swallowed hard, unable to tear her gaze away. No, no way. The thing did not respond. It simply stood there, watching them, or at least they thought. It was watching. The hollow void where its face should have been gave no clue as to its intentions, but the air around it vibrated with an energy that could not be explained. It was as if the thing itself was a presence that had no place here, an unnatural distortion of reality that had simply decided to arrive uninvited. The group held their breath. The fire crackled loudly in the silence, and the soft rustling of the leaves seemed amplified against the stillness of the figure before them. Time slowed. The moments dragged on, stretching into something inhuman. Then it spoke. The voice, if it could be called that, was not a voice at all. It was a sound, a rush of air, a rasping, hollow echo that reverberated deep inside their bones, a sound so alien, so foreign, that their very souls recoiled from it. It was a whisper, a gust of wind through dry leaves, a deep, throaty sigh from an ancient thing that had not spoken in centuries. Whistles. For you. The words were barely distinguishable, muffled beneath the hollow resonance of the voice. But it was clear enough. It was speaking to them. The thing knew their whistle. It knew them. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as the sound slithered around him, setting his nerves alight with terror. He took a step back, but his legs felt like they were encased in concrete. His body refused to obey. His brain screaming for him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the thing's eyes, bearing down on him. "What do you want?" Liam managed to croak, his voice hoarse from fear. His grip on the flashlight was faltering. It felt useless now, like a child's toy in the presence of something so ancient, so powerful. The figure did not answer. It took another step closer, its footfalls soundless on the forest floor. The shadows around it seemed to bend and stretch, as if the very darkness itself was gathering around the figure, absorbing it. The air felt too thick to breathe now. The forest had become a prison. The trees, the ground beneath their feet, the very sky above. Everything seemed to warp and twist, pressing in on them from all sides. I don't like this, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she stumbled back toward the tents, pulling Emily with her. But the figure did not move. It just stood there, its form indistinct, a spectre woven from the blackness of the forest. Behind them, the river lapped quietly, as though mocking their fear, whispering secrets only it knew. The night had deepened, stretching into a place beyond time, a place where reality itself seemed to bend and break. Then, without warning, the figure took another step forward, and the ground beneath it seemed to shift, as though it was not walking, but sinking. The air crackled. The fire sputtered and flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to dance and twist in unnatural ways. The warmth from the flames seemed to drain from the clearing, leaving only a biting cold in its wake. And then, the whistle. It wasn't from the figure. It wasn't from across the river. No, this time, the whistle came from all around them. 100 different directions, each one perfectly in sync with their own breathing, with the rapid thudding of their hearts. Each whistle was identical, sharp, shrill, the same as their own, but now there was something more to it, something wrong. Something insidious, creeping through their veins like poison. "Get back in the tents," Jake commanded, his voice hoarse, though it carried a certain authority, as if he could still manage some semblance of control. His body was trembling, but his instincts kicked in. The others didn't question him. They began scrambling for their tents, eyes wide, hearts pounding. But Emily lingered, her gaze fixed on the figure, her legs frozen in place as if they had forgotten how to move. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. "Emily!" Liam hissed, his hand outstretched, pulling her toward him. But she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the hollow shape across the clearing, as though she couldn't tear herself away. Then something twisted within the thing. Its shape rippled, contorted, and for a moment, Emily could see something else in the dark void of its face, something ancient, something that wasn't human at all. It was as though the figure was not one being, but many, layered one over the other. Faces, mouths, eyes, and all of them staring, all of them locked on her. "Emily!" Liam shouted again, his voice cracking. With a jolt, she snapped out of her trance and stumbled back, almost tripping over her own feet. She ran toward her tent, and without looking back, she threw herself inside, zipping it shut with shaking hands. But the figure didn't chase them. It didn't move again. It simply stood there, silent, as if it had no need to rush. Its presence filled the clearing, a void that swallowed the air, the sounds, everything. The forest was no longer alive with the night's usual chorus of insects and rustling leaves. It was dead silent. The figure's presence seemed to drain every sound from the world around them. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the shadows from which it had come, leaving only the lingering echo of its unsettling whistle in the empty space where it had stood. Outside, the river whispered quietly to itself, as though nothing had happened at all. But inside their tents, they could all hear it, the soft, slow echo of a whistle. The same whistle, same rhythm, same mocking tone, and it was coming from all around them. The stillness that followed the departure of the figure felt suffocating. The air in the tents hung heavy, filled with a thick, pulsing dread that clung to their skin, smothering any attempt at sleep or relief. Each of them lay wide-eyed, breathing too fast, waiting for the next sound, waiting for the next sign that something was watching, waiting just outside their thin canvas shelters. The whistle continued. At first, it was distant, far away, but as the minutes dragged on, it began to grow closer, sharper, louder. The sound rippled through the trees and over the water, echoing in the night like the call of something ancient and forgotten. They couldn't tell if it was coming from the other side of the river or from within the forest surrounding their camp. But they could hear it clearly now, identical to their own, rhythmic and mocking. Emily pulled the blankets tighter around her, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her ears. She glanced toward the opening of the tent, eyes catching the faintest movement in the shadows outside. But when she looked again, there was nothing. Only the still, oppressive dark. Liam lay still beside her, his body rigid, staring at the small slit in the tent where the moonlight trickled through. His thoughts swirled, tangled with fear and confusion. "It's just some animal," he muttered, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. His voice was barely audible against the continuous whistle that seemed to permeate the night. Then the sound stopped. Just like that. One moment, it was there, an omnipresent, ghostly tune creeping into their minds, and the next, it vanished entirely. The night, once alive with its relentless echo, fell into a suffocating silence deeper than before, as though the world itself had decided to hold its breath. Emily sat up, her pulse quickening. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Liam nodded, barely audible. It stopped. The quiet was unbearable, as though everything, the air, the earth, the trees, was holding some dark secret just beyond reach. Suddenly, a thudding noise echoed from outside their tents. It was faint at first, so faint that it could have been a trick of the wind or a tree branch falling, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was unmistakable now. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps, as if someone or something was crossing through the forest, headed directly toward their camp. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. She pulled her knees to her chest and held her breath, listening intently. The steps continued, each one a measured thud, too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate to be wind. The others in the camp heard it too, their tents shaking slightly. As they held still, the tension thick enough to choke them, Jake's voice came out in a hoarse whisper from across the fire. "We need to get out of here, now." But no one moved. The footsteps were growing closer, and then they stopped. The forest fell into an unnatural stillness. Nothing moved. No breeze rustled the leaves. The very world seemed to pause. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for the zipper of the tent, but before she could pull it open, she froze. There, just outside, in the dim light of the moon, something caught her eye. Footprints, wet, fresh. They led right up to the tents. She swallowed hard, unable to look away. They were large, too large for a person, and the ground around them was soft from the recent rain. The prints were deep, as though something heavy had walked across the forest floor. Each step was a perfect imprint, as though it had left a deep mark in the soil and the mud. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned to Liam, her face pale. "They're right outside." Liam didn't need to look. He could hear the wet, squelching sound of the prints. The same sound they had heard earlier as the thing crossed the river. And now they were here, in their camp. Sarah whispered from the next tent over, her voice cracking. "What the hell is that? Who is that?" Liam couldn't answer her. He didn't know. His mind raced, searching for a logical explanation, but all that came back was the memory of the figure, tall, hollow, standing just beyond the light of their fire. The footsteps outside their tents grew louder again, more pronounced this time, as if whatever it was had circled their camp and now stood directly behind them. Suddenly, there was a sharp rap against the side of Emily's tent. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a tap. It was a forceful thud, a hand slamming against the fabric. Emily gasped, her heart leaping into her throat as she scrambled backward, slamming herself into the back wall of the tent. "Shit, it's here," Liam hissed. Jake's voice followed in a whisper of panic, too low to be heard by anything beyond their circle. "Everyone stay quiet. Stay still." But it was too late. The thing had already found them, and now it was closer than ever. The tent shuddered under another heavy thud, then another. The fabric stretched outward as if something large was pressing against it. But nothing was visible outside the tent. There was only the sound of the thuds and the creaking of the tent as it sagged under some unseen weight. The footsteps had stopped. The weight pressing against the tent didn't move. And in the dead silence, there was something worse. Something far more terrifying than the steps, the whistles, or the uninvited presence outside. It was the whisper, not a sound of wind. Not a murmur from the forest, a voice. It was a low, hollow murmur that seeped through the fabric of their tent, as if the very air itself had become saturated with it. A deep, rasping whisper that carried an unmistakable word. Leave. The word came from all directions, echoing in their ears, ringing through their skulls. And then the footfalls resumed, closer now, louder. The figure was pacing outside their tents, making its way around them, the steps growing faster and faster, as if it had grown frustrated. Liam's hand trembled as he gripped the zipper of the tent, his eyes darting between his friends. He couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay here. But the whispers came again. Leave. Now. The sound of wet footsteps grew, and this time, when the fabric of the tent sagged under another unseen pressure, Emily's voice broke through the silence. "We have to run. We have to go now!" Her words were a gasp, a cry of panic, but they were enough to snap them into action. Liam fumbled with the zipper of his tent, pulling it open and darting into the night. The others followed quickly, their feet stumbling on the uneven ground, but they didn't stop to look behind. The dark forest around them seemed to close in, pressing tighter with each step. The only light now was the dim flicker of their flashlights, casting long, frantic shadows across the trees, and behind them, the whispers continued. Leave. 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 The wet footprints followed them, and the thing, whatever it was, had never stopped. It was closer now. They ran faster. The forest had become a labyrinth, a tangled mess of trees and shadow, as if the very path they had just taken had already shifted, rerouted, bent itself to an unnatural design. The ground beneath them felt wrong, soft and shifting in places where there should have been firm dirt, as though the earth itself was alive, swallowing their steps as they ran. Jake led the way, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness ahead. He was breathing hard, but the panic that gripped his chest was worse than the physical exertion. Behind him, the others stumbled, breathless and disoriented. They couldn't afford to stop. They couldn't afford to look back. But the whispers, those damned whispers, followed them, winding through the trees like a vengeful current. A voice that didn't need to speak aloud to be heard. It burrowed into their minds, slipping under their skin, binding them together with an unspoken terror. Keep moving, Jake barked, his voice strained. We need to get to the river. Sarah's breath was ragged as she stumbled behind him. The river? We can't. It's the only way out, isn't it? Her voice cracked as she spoke, a hint of disbelief. as though she were trying to convince herself just as much as the others. They had passed the river on the way to camp, crossed over it without thinking twice, but the water now felt like an anchor, something both safe and dangerous. If they could get there, they might have a chance. If they could cross back over, maybe they'd escape whatever was hunting them. But the river didn't feel safe. The water's surface, once calm and reassuring under the moonlight, now seemed to pulse, its gentle lapping against the shore distorted, as though it too was aware of their pursuit. They could hear it, rushing louder as they neared the bank. And then there was the whistle again. This time it was clearer, closer, undeniable. The sound ripped through the night like a jagged scream, echoing across the forest with an almost malicious clarity. It wasn't a simple signal anymore, it was calling to them. Shit, Liam gasped, his voice shaking with terror as he slowed, pausing just long enough to glance over his shoulder. Jake caught him by the arm, pulling him forward. No time, we don't have time. But Liam's eyes, wide and frantic, were locked on. Something ahead, a figure. It stood just outside the reach of their flashlight beam. Tall, still, the same shape, the same oppressive shadow. It was back, and this time, it was closer. The figure stood at the riverbank, looming silently, its silhouette merging with the dense blackness of the trees behind it. The same hollow void where a face should have been, the same unnerving stillness. Its presence seemed to swallow the air around it. The trees themselves recoiled from it, bending away from its unnatural pull. Get to the river, Jake shouted again, though his own voice was strangled by the sight of the thing standing across from them. But as they neared the water, something began to change. The river was different. It wasn't just the oppressive weight of the figure on the opposite shore. It wasn't just the echoing whistle still lingering in the air. No, it was the water itself. The current, once gentle and calm, now surged violently. The water churned and twisted, as if something beneath it was thrashing in a desperate, violent struggle to break free. Liam's foot splashed into the shallows of the river first, the water colder than it should have been, the chills sinking into his bones immediately. He recoiled, the sting of the cold worse than he had anticipated. But before he could pull his foot back, something pulled at his leg. "Liam!" Sarah shouted, her voice high with panic. She grabbed his arm to help him, but the current was strong now, unnaturally strong. And it wasn't just the river that seemed to have a grip on him, a wet, slimy feeling wrapped around his ankle, tightening with unholy force. And before Liam could react, the sensation was replaced by a pressure, an unbearable force pulling him forward, dragging him into the murky water. His flashlight dropped into the river with a soft, hollow plunk as the current surged over him. "No, get out of there!" Emily screamed, her eyes wide as she grabbed at Liam's shoulders, pulling with all her strength. But it was useless. The water was alive. The current shifted once more, violent, furious, and Liam was yanked further into the river, his legs kicking wildly as something unseen dragged him beneath the surface. The night air was filled with the sound of rushing water, the splash of his body being pulled under, but then nothing. Everything went quiet. "No!" Jake shouted, moving to dive in after him. But before he could even move a single step, something stopped him. A hand. No, not a hand. Something touched his chest, an unseen force pushing him back with the kind of strength that could shatter bones. He stumbled and fell backward, landing hard against the rocks, gasping for breath. Then the whisper came. Again, but this time it wasn't in their minds, it was in the air. Leave. The voice was like the river itself, hollow, ancient, resonating with an authority beyond anything they could comprehend. But the presence on the other side of the river was not the only thing watching them now. Something was shifting in the depths of the water. Something was rising. The ripples on the surface of the river began to widen, as though something beneath the water was moving toward them. It felt deliberate, a presence stalking them from below. The air was thick with an invisible weight. a sense of dread that seeped into their lungs and wrapped around their throats like a noose. And then, from the shadows on the other side of the river, the figure moved. It glided forward, the sound of its footsteps muted by the rushing water. It was as if the river parted for it, a path opening before it. Its form twisted and wavered, an unnatural fluidity that defied everything they knew of the world. And it was coming toward them. The whispers returned, but now they were more than words. They were commands, resonating deep inside their chest, pulling at their very essence. Come closer. The figure on the opposite shore began to cross the river, its silhouette shifting, elongating, stretching impossibly tall as it moved forward. The current seemed to part for it, as though the water itself recognized the thing's power. Liam's body floated limply in the current, now lost to the shadows beneath the surface. The water had claimed him, but it had also released something. Something that was waiting. And now the others could feel it. Something was about to break. The figure stepped closer. The river continued its violent churn, and all around them the forest held its breath, waiting. The moon hung high, an indifferent witness to the chaos unfolding in the forest. Its pale light illuminated the turmoil below, casting ghostly shadows across the water, where the surface no longer seemed like water at all. The river was an entity unto itself, swirling with an energy that neither nature nor man could explain. The very current felt wrong, almost alive. It dragged at their limbs, gnawed at their resolve, pulling their feet deeper into the cold, slick mud. The figure, towering and incomprehensible, was not moving like a human being anymore. It flowed. Its limbs were elongating, twisting, unraveling in unnatural ways. The ripples of the water parted for it, as though it were commanding the very earth itself. And with every step it took, every inch it drew closer to the bank, the whispers grew louder, thicker, more insistent. They surrounded the group now, a crushing presence that tugged at their thoughts, warped their perceptions. Come closer. The voice was neither male nor female, nor even a single voice at all. It was a chorus of many, layered, distant, but so close. The words rang out in every corner of their minds, an unbearable pressure that threatened to crack their sanity. Emily stumbled backward, a scream rising in her throat. She grasped the edge of a tree for support, but the ground under her feet felt unstable, like the earth was shifting, trembling beneath them. "Why are we still here?" Jake rasped, his throat dry, panic rising in his chest. He glanced between the water, the figure, and the others. His mind raced, desperate for something, anything, that would explain this, make it stop. "We need to leave. Now." But the whispers, they had changed. No longer the plea of a distant voice. Now it was an invitation to come across. Each word seemed to pull at their souls, sinking into their bones, as though the figure on the other side of the river wasn't simply beckoning them physically, it was inviting them into something darker, into a place where the rules of time and space were irrelevant, a world where they would never be able to escape. And then they understood, truly understood, what the river was. It wasn't just water, it was a barrier, a boundary between two worlds, a place where the lost went to drown, where the guilty wandered forever, unable to escape the current that was always just one step behind them. And now it was trying to drag them under as well. The river, and the thing waiting on the opposite shore, was not just an ancient evil. It was a guardian, a force, a judge. "Please," Emily gasped, her voice raw with terror. "What do you want from us? What is this?" The figure didn't answer her with words. It didn't need to. The air itself seemed to shift, and the water swirled, violently pulling her gaze to the surface. There, in the depths of the river, a shape began to rise. A reflection of Liam. His face appeared in the water, pale, lifeless, eyes wide open, but staring with no recognition. His body floated on the surface of the water, distorted by the ripples. His limbs hung limply, twisted in a way that only death could explain. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made Emily's stomach drop and her heart freeze. There was a whisper, a desperate whisper that rose from the depths of his still mouth. "It's not over." Not yet. The water churned beneath his body, his form twisting unnaturally, as though some unseen force was pulling him deeper, forcing him into a space between life and death. But even in that cold reflection, something shifted, something alive. And it was reaching for them. The ground underfoot quaked again. The figure across the river was now close. So close that Emily could see the outline of its distorted form clearly. The water trembled at its feet as it stretched its arms out, not to them, but to the river itself, as though it were commanding the river to accept them. "Step forward." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a decree, a binding command, one that felt both ancient and inescapable. The group froze, terror and uncertainty sinking their bones. Liam's body, still floating on the surface, suddenly twitched. It jerked upward as if some unseen force was pulling him back from the depths. But as his body contorted, Emily's mind raced. No, it wasn't Liam. Not anymore. Not the Liam she had known. That figure on the opposite shore was not Liam's spirit calling to her. It was something else entirely. Something hungry. The whispers began to rise again, this time louder, harsher. The water surged forward, lapping at their ankles, pulling them with an almost sentient malice. But the figure was still not moving. Its form remained frozen, watching them. "Step forward. It's time to come home." The words twisted around their minds, pulling at them like the tide pulls a body under. The figure's face remained a void, but Emily swore just for a moment. She could see it, Liam's face, as though he were trapped beneath that impenetrable darkness. She didn't know if it was real or if the terror had warped her perception, but she could feel it. Feel his loss, his presence, like a lingering breath that hovered between the two worlds. And then, as if the ground beneath them had given way, Sarah stepped forward. It wasn't deliberate. She wasn't even aware of it. 1 second, she was frozen in place, and the next, her foot slid into the water, her body following with a fluid motion, as though some invisible force had pulled her into the current. "Sarah!" Jake screamed, reaching for her, but his hand fell short. His body twisted in a desperate attempt to grab her, but it was too late. She was already gone. The water had swallowed her whole, the last echoes of her voice trailing off as it consumed. Oh, and in the distance the figure remained, unchanging, watching, waiting. "One has crossed," the whispers rang out. "One has returned." Emily couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Only the pounding of her heart echoed in her ears, louder than any voice. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, the earth beneath her feet trembling with the power of something vast, something ancient. Her hands, slick with sweat, reached out for anything solid, anything to stop herself from sinking into the abyss with Sarah. But the whispers had already found her, drowning her thoughts with their insidious "Pull, come across." A hand touched her shoulder. She whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. But no one was there. Her heart skipped a beat. The river surged, and in the distance, something broke the surface. The river was calling, and now Emily would have to decide whether to answer. Would she become the next one to step forward, or would she refuse and risk losing everything? The moment Sarah's body disappeared beneath the water, it was as if time itself had been swallowed up, consumed by the river's cold, endless depths. Emily could feel it, this oppressive stillness that descended upon them like a heavy, suffocating fog. The once vibrant forest, full of life and sound, had turned into something foreign, a place that no longer welcomed them. The trees seemed to shrink back from the water, their branches bowing under some unseen pressure, and the shadows around them grew deeper, more consuming. Sarah. No. Jake's voice cracked as he fell to his knees by the riverbank, his hands trembling as he reached into the water, as if to pull her back. But the river didn't care. It had already claimed her. The current rolled past him, indifferent to his grief, to his desperation. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had seen it happen. Sarah, swallowed whole by the river's unnatural hunger. And she knew that the same thing awaited anyone who lingered too long at the edge of this cursed place. The river wasn't just a barrier between worlds. It was a devourer, a hungry beast that didn't need to show its fangs to kill. Liam had been its first victim, and now Sarah. And yet, the figure on the other side of the river, it still waited. Jake, we have to move. Emily's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the thick air like a knife. The force of her words startled him, dragging him back from his blind panic. But his eyes were wide with disbelief, a darkness settling in his pupils that she had never seen before. Move? Where? Jake's voice trembled, the harshness of his words masked by the crack of fear beneath them. Do you think it'll let us go? Do you think we can leave? Emily's eyes flicked back to the water, where the ripples were now unnervingly still, and the figure, that looming, shadowy figure across the river, was no longer standing still. It was moving, its limbs, impossibly long, stretched toward them, reaching. The darkness in the forest thickened around it, as though it were feeding on the night itself. Come closer, it commanded once more, the voice seeping into their minds like an icy hand. It wasn't just the river anymore that held them. It was the air, the space between them and everything that was once familiar. The power of that voice, the force of its will, was absolute. Emily could feel her body responding against her own will, her feet sliding toward the water as if an invisible string had begun to pull her forward. She shook her head violently, her teeth gritting as she fought the tide inside her. Don't listen to it, she gasped, her hands clawing at the earth, desperate to hold her ground. Jake, we need to fight it. But even as she spoke, the whispers twisted into a maddening crescendo. Fighting it seemed so futile, refusing seemed impossible. Every cell in her body screamed for her to cross the river, to give in, to allow whatever it was on the other side to claim her too. It was a lure, seductive and cruel. Jake too was struggling. His expression, once filled with the fire of defiance, now softened under the pull of the figure. His hands moved almost involuntarily toward the water. He looked at Emily, eyes wide and pleading, but they were glassy, distant, as if the part of him that resisted was already slipping away. Step forward. The voice was low now, almost gentle, as though coaxing them into a terrible lullaby. It promised peace. It promised the end of the torment. It promised belonging. The whispers of the river danced in Emily's mind, crawling beneath her skin. Jake, don't do it. Her voice broke, raw and desperate. She could feel herself weakening, the words slipping from her grasp. She tried to pull him back, to stop him from stepping into the water, but his body had already begun to obey the call, like a marionette caught in a trance. He looked at her then, really looked at her. His face was pale, tears streaming down his cheeks. I'm sorry, Emily, but it's too late. He whispered it softly, as though confessing, but there was no fear left in his voice, only resignation. Before Emily could stop him, before she could even reach out, Jake took a step forward, just one step. The water beneath his foot rippled with a sudden force, a violent current that had been lying in wait. He stumbled, and in an instant, the river's hunger opened up to swallow him whole. "No!" Emily screamed, reaching desperately for him. But it was as if the world itself had collapsed in on her. The water surged upward, pulling Jake into its depths. His body twisted in an agonizing way, limbs flailing for a second. But in the end, there was nothing. Nothing but the dark, swirling river. Her heart pounded in her chest, her vision blurring with the tears that flooded her eyes. But before she could process what had just happened, the whispers grew louder. The thing on the other side of the river was now standing fully visible. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were elongated, stretching toward the heavens like twisted branches reaching out from a storm-scarred tree. Its face, though empty of features, seemed to shift and distort, as if it were both everything and nothing at once. And then it moved. It didn't walk, not in any traditional sense. It glided. The air around it bent and pulsed, heavy with the power of a force that was older than the earth itself. "You will come with us." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. And then, there it was. A flicker of recognition, an understanding that cut through Emily's panic like a knife. It wasn't just that they had to cross. It was that they already had. The moment the first foot had stepped into the river, the bargain had been struck. The moment they had come to this cursed place, they had sealed their fate. The figure, it had been waiting. And now, it was time for the last sacrifice. Emily felt the cold grip of the water as it crept up her legs. The current seemed to pull with gentle insistence. It no longer mattered if she resisted. It was too late. "Step forward, Emily. The river has claimed you." She tried. Oh, how she tried. Her arms reached out, grasping for anything, but there was no escaping it. The river was no longer a mere obstacle. It was a living thing, a force, a god, and she was its offering. But as she stepped forward, with the weight of inevitability pulling at her very soul, the world around her shifted again. The figure across the river, it was no longer watching. It had become her reflection. And as Emily stepped into the water, her heart beating in time with the river's pulse, she realized that the river's current had never been a force against them. It had always been a current of them, a current of souls bound by ancient promises. And now, she was part of it. The whispers ceased. The river was silent, and the figure across from her, her own reflection, was finally at rest. The river had claimed its last soul, and the forest, for the first time in ages, was still. The world went still. For a moment there was no sound. The rushing water, the shrill calls of the forest, the ceaseless whispers that had filled the air, all of it was gone, as if the river itself had exhaled a final empty breath. Emily's legs were numb, her body strangely weightless, yet the water around her was no longer cold, no longer relentless. It had become warm, inviting, as if it were cradling her in a soft embrace, coaxing her to let go, to release all the fear, the grief, the terror that had gripped her heart ever since they had set foot in this forsaken place. Her feet sank deeper into the mud beneath the surface, each step she took pulling her down into the heart of the river, into something darker and more profound than the physical world. She didn't know what awaited her beneath the depths, but she didn't care anymore. The river had claimed her, just as it had claimed Liam and Sarah and Jake. The whispers in her mind had quieted, replaced by something else, something calm, something final. It is done. The words were spoken not in a voice, but in her thoughts, a deep resonance that vibrated through her bones. Emily opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to demand answers, but no sound came. She could feel the pressure of the water around her, but it wasn't suffocating. It was like being pulled into an abyss where breath no longer mattered, where time had no meaning. And then she saw it. In the dark water ahead, something shifted. A shape, a light. Not a physical light, but a soft glow that seemed to pulse from the depths of the river itself, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. The glow spread outward, illuminating the murkiness, revealing the skeletal remains of those who had come before her. Countless lost souls, their eyes wide and glassy, their forms barely recognizable, tangled in the river's ever-churning grasp. But Emily couldn't look away from the glow. It was beautiful in a way. The soft, ethereal light wrapped around her like a warm shroud, filling her chest with an unsettling comfort. She wanted to reach out to it, to touch it, to understand it. But before she could move, the current, now much stronger, pulled her downward with a force that left her breathless. And in that moment, as she sank deeper, a figure emerged from the glow. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything that could be explained. But it was familiar. Liam. Not the twisted, haunting reflection she had seen on the river's surface. Not the body that had been dragged beneath the waves. No, this Liam was different. Whole. His face was calm, peaceful, untouched by the horrors of the river. His eyes, once wide with fear, now shone with an understanding that cut through the stillness like a beacon. Emily. His voice was soft, not spoken aloud, but in her very soul, as though the river itself carried it with the current. Liam. Her voice was a mere whisper, breaking the stillness around them. But even as she spoke his name, the words felt wrong. She didn't belong here. This wasn't the Liam she knew. This was something else. Liam extended a hand toward her, and Emily hesitated, her heart racing. She could feel the pull of his presence, the warmth of his light. But there was something cold beneath it, something hidden, something ancient. And then she saw it. Behind him, just out of the reach of the glowing light, there was another figure, familiar in its own way. It was Sarah. Her form, twisted, disfigured by the water, was barely human, just a shadow of the person Emily had known. Sarah's eyes were open wide, her mouth moving as if trying to speak, but no sound escaped her lips. She reached toward Emily, her arms outstretched, her face frozen in a silent scream. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. This was no reunion. This was not salvation. This was a trap. Liam's face softened, his expression one of pity. It's time, Emily. You have to accept it. She recoiled, her chest tightening with panic. Accept what? The river, he said, the words echoing with an inescapable finality. It's the only way. You've been chosen, just like all of us. This is how it ends. No! Emily cried, her voice cracking. I don't want this. I can't accept it. But even as she shouted, the glow around Liam's form seemed to flicker, the warmth slowly shifting to something colder, darker. The water around her began to churn again, this time with more force, more violence, pulling her deeper. Her hands clawed at the water, desperate to stop herself from sinking, but the current was unrelenting. It was dragging her into the depths, into the darkness. You have no choice, the voice of the river whispered again, not just in her mind, but in her very bones, in every cell of her body. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a command. It was truth, the truth of the river, the truth of the bargain that had been struck long before Emily had ever arrived. Liam's figure flickered again, his face twisting into something almost unrecognizable, as the waters began to swallow him too. And then, in a flash of searing clarity, Emily understood. The river had never been a place of life. It was a place of transition, a place between worlds. A world where souls did not die, but where they were bound, caught forever in an endless cycle, fed upon by the river's hunger, forced to become part of its eternal current. This was the price for crossing, the price for answering the river's call. And now it was her turn. She tried to scream, tried to fight, but her body no longer obeyed. The river had claimed her, body and soul. The figures that had once been her friends, her loved ones, were already fading into the water, their eyes locked onto hers with a haunting, eternal gaze. They had become part of the river, part of the current. And now she would join them. No more resistance, the river's voice whispered, wrapping around her mind, around her heart. You belong to the current now. And as the water swallowed her whole, as she was pulled under into the depths, she realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. The river would never let her go. There would be no salvation. Only the endless, unforgiving current, the final current. The river had claimed her too. The world beneath the river's surface was alive. Not in the way that the forest had once thrived, full of movement and breathing life, but alive in a suffocating eternal stillness, alive with the souls of the lost, their voices smothered, their bodies twisted into shapes that defied nature. Emily felt herself being pulled through the water, no longer able to control her limbs, her thoughts. She was nothing but a weight, sinking deeper into the abyss as the river consumed her. But then, the current slowed, the pull, that agonizing, inevitable drag, seemed to ease. She no longer felt herself being swallowed, but suspended, as if floating. The water around her shimmered with the soft glow of an otherworldly light. But it wasn't the glow that had once beckoned her. No, this was different. This light was colder, more distant, like the faint pulse of a forgotten star, far above the surface of the world. For a moment, Emily's thoughts were sluggish, clouded, as if she had fallen into a deep sleep. The voices that had filled her head, the whispers of the river, had receded into silence. There was no longer a call, no longer the incessant, gnawing hunger. The world around her was still, quiet. Then she saw them. They were not just figures. They were not mere reflections in the water, like Sarah or Liam had been. They were the others, the souls who had been lost to the river before her. They moved through the dark depths like shadows, their eyes glowing faintly, watching her with expressions of emptiness, of suffering. Some had their hands pressed to the water's surface, trying in vain to reach for something, anything, but there was no escape. They were prisoners of the river just as she had become. Emily could feel their eyes on her, could sense their longing. Their gazes followed her as she floated deeper into the darkness, their presence suffocating, oppressive. There was no warmth here, no comfort in the light. Only the cold, unyielding grip of the river, tightening its hold with every passing second. And yet somehow she understood. They were not angry. They were not vengeful. They were simply waiting. Waiting, as she would be, for something that had no name. Something that could never be given a voice. For what? Emily did not know. But she felt it in the depths of her soul, as if the river itself was speaking to her, not through words, but through its unrelenting pull. Then, something else moved in the water. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't a figure caught in the current, not a lost soul who had long since become part of the river's dark harvest. This was something new, something that watched. She could feel its presence, as cold and sharp as the knife edge of winter, pressing in around her. It was not the same shadowy figure that had beckoned to her from across the river. No, this was different. This was something older. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The force of its being was enough to fill the space around her, to make the water grow still with its attention. She could see it now, the way it moved in the distance, coiling through the depths, its form shifting and contorting like a thing that was both there and not there. It was like the river itself had come alive, had grown teeth, had taken a form of its own. It was not human. It wasn't even alive in the way that things in the world were alive. It was ancient, a force beyond time, something that had waited in the depths for centuries, perhaps longer, hungry for what it had not been given. It was the true hunger. And in that moment, Emily knew. The river had always been a thing of hunger, but it was merely a servant to something deeper, something far more terrible. The true master of the river was not the current, but the thing that lay below, far beneath, in the silence of the deep. It began to move toward her, its shape twisted and warped, slipping through the water like a shadow, growing larger and darker. The closer it came, her heart began to pound in her chest, her body frozen, her mouth open in a silent scream. She tried to move, to swim, but her limbs wouldn't obey. The water had become a prison. Each stroke of her arms against its weight, a futile attempt to escape. The thing closed in on her, and she could see it clearly now. Its body, a mass of shifting tendrils, impossibly long, stretching toward her. At the center of it, where its heart would be, was a black void, an endless, swallowing abyss that seemed to pull the very light from the water around it. This was it, the thing that had always been there, waiting, lurking beneath the river's surface. The river wasn't a natural force, it was a womb, and this was its creator. It opened its maw, if it could be called that, and Emily felt herself drawn toward it. A deep, inescapable pull, like gravity itself, had turned on her. Every inch of her being screamed for escape, for release, but there was no escape. Only this thing, this hunger. And then she saw them again, the faces of those who had come before her. Sarah, Jake, Liam. Their eyes were wide, pleading, their forms ghostly in the dim glow of the depths. They reached toward her, not to pull her away, but to guide her, to show her what she had to do. They had been waiting for her, just as they had waited for the others. They had accepted their fate. And now, Emily realized the truth. The river wasn't just a killer. It was a filter, a keeper of souls, and this thing below, it was the root of all of it. The source. It was the end of the cycle. The thing reached out with its tendrils, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She knew what it wanted. She knew it had to be done. To give in would mean her release, her escape from the never-ending hunger of the river. But at what cost? The faces of her friends seemed to blur, their silent pleas echoing through her mind. They had given in. They had let the river take them. Would she be the last? Her eyes turned back to the abyss, to the thing that waited for her. And then, in the very heart of the river's cold, unforgiving darkness, she understood. The river never wanted them. It wanted her, the last soul, the final offering, the end. And there was no escape. The last thing Emily felt before the water swallowed her entirely was the gentle, weightless sensation of being claimed. Emily's world collapsed into cold. And then, nothing. She could no longer feel the water against her skin, no longer hear the whispers of the river's call. The crushing darkness around her thickened like a veil, pulling her into its endless, suffocating embrace. There was no light, no sound, no movement, only the eerie silence of the depths, the complete absence of anything that was once familiar. And yet, despite the overwhelming stillness, she felt alive. For the briefest moment, a strange clarity settled over her, a moment of transcendence where her body and mind seemed to float outside of her own experience. It was as though she had been separated from her physical form and had become something more, something other. She had crossed over. She had become the river. But then the memories came, not in waves, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible ripple that began to fill the silence. She saw flashes of faces, familiar faces that had long since disappeared beneath the water. Faces that had once smiled, laughed, and whispered in the night. The laughter of her friends, her family, echoed through her mind, faint but present. She saw their eyes, their gazes full of warmth, their voices carrying her name. Then, she saw something else, something darker. Faces twisted in terror. The agony of those who had come before her, their eyes wide and pleading for release from the river's grasp. Their bodies, still and lifeless, were caught in the current. They were not gone. They had never left. Emily began to feel the weight of their suffering press against her chest. Their lives, their souls, all fused with the river. She could feel them now, their hunger, their desire to escape, and she realized with a chilling clarity that she was no longer Emily. She was something much more. She was everything that the river had taken. A vast, incomprehensible consciousness flooded her mind, a collective yearning that stretched across the river's expanse, bound by the endless cycle of death and rebirth. The river was more than just a place. It was a force, a sentient being stretching across time, devouring the lost and the forgotten, and she had become its part. Her own thoughts, her own identity seemed to blur as she sank deeper into the river's memory. There was no longer a clear distinction between her and those who had drowned before her. She was now an echo, a shadow of the countless souls that had been claimed by the depths. She felt their sorrow, their anger, their regret. She felt their endless longing to be free, a freedom that the river would never grant. It had always been this way. And then, as though from the deepest part of her being, a new thought surfaced, one that had been planted there, like a seed. It wasn't her thought, but the river's. It was time. The river was ready to claim another, to carry the cycle forward. Emily felt her presence, the absence of her body, the transformation from living flesh to something far older, far colder. Her thoughts, her memories merged with the countless others, and she understood the truth of her existence in this place. She was not meant to rest, not meant to escape. She was meant to be the end. But just as she fully surrendered to this overwhelming consciousness, something changed. A flicker of light pierced the darkness. It was small at first, barely visible, but it grew, slowly, deliberately, until it became a shining point in the distance. The light was real. It was alive. Emily's essence recoiled in surprise. The light, though faint, was not part of the river. It did not belong to the river. It was a beacon, a call from the world above. And then she realized. It was them, Sarah, Jake, and Liam. The faces from before, but now, different. They were standing in the light, their forms barely visible but unmistakable. Their eyes were clear, no longer filled with fear, no longer lost in the river's embrace. They looked at her with recognition, waiting. This was not an illusion. This was not the twisted reflection she had seen earlier. They had escaped. Their forms shimmered with the same light that now pulled her upward, beckoning her toward something more than the river's cold embrace. Their hands, once broken and lost beneath the current, now reached out to her in a gesture of invitation. Come. It was the first time in what felt like an eternity that Emily heard her name, spoken clearly, without the distortion of the river's endless pull. Emily. The voice came not from their mouths, but from the very air around her. A familiar whisper, soft and gentle. It was Liam. Not the version she had seen in the depths of the river, but the real Liam, the one who had shared her laughter, her love, the one who had once held her hand on long walks beneath the stars. "You can leave," he said, his voice stronger now, filled with warmth. "You can be free. Come back." The pull of the river was still strong, but now, for the first time, Emily could feel herself pulling away. Her essence, tangled with the river's cold grasp, was beginning to unravel, like threads loosening from an old tapestry. She could feel the presence of the lost souls surrounding her, their cries filling her mind. They were not angry. They were not resentful. They were sad. And they all knew that Emily could not save them. She could not bring them back. But she could save herself. With every ounce of her being, she fought the river's relentless grip. Her thoughts, her memories, all that she had once been, slowly unraveled. The river fought back, pulling harder, but the light ahead, her way out, was stronger now. It was real. And as she felt herself break free, as the coldness of the river's hold loosened around her, she heard one final whisper. It is never over. And then, she was gone. When Emily awoke, she was not beneath the river, not swallowed by its depths. She was lying on soft grass, the chill of night air against her skin. She could taste the familiar salt of tears on her lips, could hear the rustling of leaves in the trees. For a moment, she thought it was a dream. But when she opened her eyes fully, she saw them. Sarah, Jake, and Liam stood nearby, their faces solemn but warm, their eyes filled with understanding. They had come to greet her, their spirits now free from the river's curse. They were waiting. Emily sat up slowly, taking in the world around her, the forest, the stars above. It was so quiet now, so still. The river's call was far behind her. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Liam stepped forward, his expression soft but distant. "It's over, Emily. You're free now. But the river, it never lets go. You'll always be a part of it. Always." Emily felt a shiver run through her, a memory of the river's dark depth still lingering in her mind. It was a part of her now, and the thought was both comforting and terrifying. She stood up slowly, looking back one last time at the river in the distance. The waters were calm, but she could feel its presence, ever watchful, ever hungry. She would never forget. And as the three figures of her friends walked beside her into the woods, the wind whispered through the trees. The river remembers, and though Emily was free, she knew the river would always be waiting. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the deep, earthy musk of the forest that clung to everything. Emily breathed it in as she walked beside her friends, their shadows long and strange beneath the pale moonlight. The trees, ancient and towering, stretched up toward the heavens as if watching them, waiting. She could feel the presence of the woods around her, alive, yet distant, its ancient eyes turned away. They walked in silence, her companions' faces serene. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Something lingered just beyond the reach of her senses, like a half-remembered dream, a presence that had never fully let her go. The further they moved from the river's edge, the more distant its call seemed. But still, she couldn't erase the memories that pulsed within her, images of faces lost to the dark, shadows that swirled beneath the current, the cold, unrelenting pull of the water. She tried to tell herself it was over, that it was done. But deep down, in a place she couldn't name, she knew. The river was never truly gone. It wasn't just a body of water. It was a part of her now. And no matter how far she walked, no matter how far she ran, its whispers would always follow. "Do you feel it?" Liam's voice broke through the silence, quiet and low. Emily stopped walking, turning to face him. His gaze was distant, his expression heavy, like he was carrying something he didn't know how to set down. "Feel what?" Emily asked, her voice thick with confusion. "The weight of it," he said, a small, sad smile curling at the corner of his lips. "The way the river doesn't let you go. You can walk away, you can run, but there's a piece of you that will always remain in the dark water. Emily felt the shiver crawl up her spine. She wanted to speak, to argue, but the truth of his words hung in the air between them, unspoken. The river had always been more than just a place. It had always been a presence, an entity that lived within their memories, their desires, their regrets. "You're still connected to it, Emily." Jake spoke now, his voice soft but full of understanding. "It was never just about you. It took us all. We were its keepers, its victims, its whispers. And you're the last piece, the one who came back." She didn't need to ask him what he meant. She could feel it, like a weight pressing on her chest, the need to understand, to remember. Her mind reached for the fragments of knowledge that still burned like embers in her thoughts, the truth of the river's hunger, of the thing beneath it, the twisted ancient force waiting in the depths. And then it hit her, the faces, all the faces she had seen in the river, the souls who had been trapped, lost in its currents. Their faces were still there, still waiting, still alive in a way. Their memories bound to the water, tied to the river as tightly as hers had been. The thing in the depths didn't just consume, it absorbed. It took them in, made them part of itself. And in doing so, it ensured that the river's hunger would never cease. "You mean I'm the last one?" Emily whispered, the question barely leaving her lips before she realized the answer was all around her. She was the one who had escaped. But the cycle wasn't broken. It would never end. Liam nodded, his face unreadable. "The river doesn't forget, Emily. It only waits. You were its final offering, its last soul. But it's still hungry, and it's still out there, calling, waiting." The wind stirred in the trees, the sound of it like a low hum, a song that carried with it the promise of something darker, something colder. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart began to race and her breath hitched as she turned, instinctively glancing toward the river in the distance. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. The presence, the thing that had claimed so many before her. And it was still there, watching, waiting, remembering. "Are you saying it's not over?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the realization. Jake shook his head. "No, it's never over. The river's memory doesn't die. You can escape its waters, but the river never forgets what it's taken. It keeps a piece of every soul that's ever crossed its path. And the thing below, it feeds on that. It's always been this way." Emily felt her chest tighten. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, suffocating, like the river's cold fingers were already wrapped around her heart again. It hadn't been a coincidence that she had been the one to escape. She wasn't special. She was just another thread in the web that the river wove. And now that she was free, the river would reach for others, just as it had reached for her. And the cycle would continue. The memory of the river and the thing beneath would never be erased. She heard footsteps behind her, and when she turned, Sarah was standing there, her face solemn, her eyes full of quiet understanding. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Emily knew what she meant. Sarah had lived through it too. She had felt the hunger, the call, and even in the afterlife, she hadn't truly escaped. "We're all part of it now, Emily," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible against the night. "But you're not alone. Not anymore." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She simply nodded, knowing deep down that this truth was the only truth left. She could keep walking, keep running, but she would never truly escape the river's grip. It was in her veins now, flowing through her like the very blood in her body, And then, in the stillness of the night, Emily heard it. A soft whistle. It echoed through the trees, low and distant, but unmistakable. A sound that sent a chill down her spine, a memory that she couldn't erase. It was the river, the call. And as she listened to the sound fade into the distance, she realized it would always follow, always wait, always hunger. She would never be free. The river would never forget her. It would never forget anyone. In the deep, cold waters of the river, a shadow stirred beneath the surface, and the hunger stirred with it.